Hey everyone, a big welcome back to our awesome subscribers and a special shout out to those of you tuning in for the first time. You've landed in the perfect place for spine-chilling stories that might just keep you up all night. Before we dive into today's creepy tale, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Our community is growing fast and it's amazing to see how far it reaches. And don't forget, if you don't want to miss out on our future videos that'll have you second guessing every sound in your house, make sure to hit subscribe and ring the notification bell. Otherwise, you might not receive our latest uploads. All right, let's jump into it. Story 1. The mirror in the attic. It was the kind of discovery you dream about when you buy an old house, an attic untouched for decades, filled with forgotten belongings, boxes covered in dust, old furniture hidden beneath sheets, and trinkets left behind by previous owners. I had always been fascinated by the past, so when I bought my new home, I was excited to explore the attic and see what secrets it held. The house itself was over a century old, with creaky floorboards, tall ceilings, and that distinct smell of age that old homes have. The attic, though, had clearly been neglected for years. The wooden staircase leading up to it was narrow and steep, the kind that creaked with every step. When I first opened the attic door, a gust of cool, stale air greeted me, and I had to brush away cobwebs as I made my way inside. The space was dark, the only light coming from a small, dirty window at the far end. Dust particles danced in the weak sunlight as I stepped deeper into the attic, my feet disturbing the thick layer of dust that coated the floor. The room was cluttered with boxes and furniture, all covered in heavy, yellowed sheets. I started moving things aside, rummaging through old books, letters, and family heirlooms that had been left behind. It felt like stepping into another time, like I was uncovering pieces of history that had been forgotten. But as I moved deeper into the attic, I found something I wasn't expecting. At the far end of the room, leaning against the wall, was a tall, ornate mirror. It was unlike anything else in the attic, beautifully crafted, with an intricate gold frame that was tarnished with age. The glass, however, was pristine, not a single speck of dust on it, as if it had been polished recently. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. The image was clear, but something about it felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the longer I looked, the more unsettled I felt. My reflection seemed slightly distorted, like a funhouse mirror, but only just enough to make me uneasy. It wasn't immediately obvious, just something that nagged at the back of my mind. I brushed it off, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the dim light of the attic. I spent the rest of the day sorting through boxes and cleaning up, but the image of the mirror stayed with me. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day, I went back up to the attic, curious about the mirror and eager to examine it more closely. When I reached it, though, I realized something strange. The mirror had moved. It wasn't where I had left it the day before. Instead of leaning against the wall, it now stood upright, positioned perfectly in the center of the attic. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I hadn't moved it. No one else had been in the house. I was living alone. But there it was, standing in a different spot, as if someone had carefully placed it there. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe I had moved it and forgotten. Or maybe it had just shifted on its own, somehow. I wasn't sure, but I didn't like the feeling that was creeping over me. I stepped closer to the mirror, my reflection staring back at me as I approached. The unease from the day before returned, stronger this time. My reflection didn't look quite right. My face was the same, my hair the same, but there was something in my eyes, a flicker of something that wasn't mine. I leaned in closer, studying my reflection. The light in the attic was dim, but as I stared at the glass, I saw the faintest movement just behind my reflection. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but I was sure of it. Something moved behind me in the mirror, just at the edge of my vision. I whipped around, my heart pounding, but the attic was empty. Nothing but dust and old furniture. I turned back to the mirror, my breath quickening. My reflection was normal again, still unmoving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was watching me through the glass. I left the attic, my skin crawling with unease. That night I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the mirror. I couldn't stop thinking about the way it had moved, the way my reflection hadn't quite looked like me. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I wasn't imagining things. The next morning, I decided to move the mirror. I didn't want it in the house anymore. I grabbed a sheet and went up to the attic, determined to cover it up and put it out of sight. But when I got there, I froze. The mirror wasn't in the attic. I looked around, my heart racing. It was gone. The entire attic was exactly how I had left it except for the mirror. It had vanished. I searched the house, checking every room, every corner, but it was nowhere to be found. I couldn't understand how it had disappeared. It had been too large, too heavy to just vanish without a trace. I was alone in the house. No one else had been there, so where had it gone? That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The house felt different, darker, colder. I kept hearing strange noises, soft creaks and whispers that seemed to come from the walls. I told myself it was just the house settling, but deep down, I knew something else was happening. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it. A soft, slow scrape like something heavy being dragged across the floor. My heart leaped into my throat as I sat up in bed, listening. The sound was coming from upstairs, from the attic. Care. I grabbed my phone, using the flashlight as I made my way up the narrow staircase, my hands trembling. As I reached the top, the sound grew louder, closer. I took a deep breath, pushing open the attic door, the hinges creaking as I stepped inside. The attic was dark, the air thick and cold. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the clutter of boxes and furniture, but then I saw it standing in the middle of the room. The mirror. It had returned, its gold frame gleaming in the light of my flashlight, the glass perfectly clean and polished. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, unable to comprehend how it had moved back into the attic. I hadn't brought it there. I hadn't even touched it, but it was there, waiting for me. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. My reflection stared back at me, the same uneasy expression on its face. I leaned in, shining the flashlight on the glass, searching for any sign of movement. Then, just as I was about to turn away, it happened. My reflection blinked. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I hadn't blinked. I was sure of it. But my reflection had. It stood there staring at me with the same face, the same clothes, but its eyes. They were different, darker, colder, as if something else was looking out from behind them. And then, slowly, my reflection smiled. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my flashlight flickering in my trembling hands. The smile on my reflection's face widened, stretching unnaturally across its face, and I realized with a jolt of terror that whatever was in the mirror wasn't me. It was something else. Something that had been watching me, waiting. I ran. I bolted out of the attic, slamming the door behind me as I raced down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the cold night air, gasping for breath. I never went back into that attic. I sold the house a few months later without ever mentioning the mirror to the new owners. But sometimes, I still see it in my dreams or in the reflection of a window or a shiny surface. The faint image of my reflection, smiling back at me with that same unnatural grin. And I know, deep down, that it's still watching. Story 2. The midnight knocking at the cabin. The drive through the dense forest had been uneventful, with the winding road snaking through towering pines, their shadows stretching long in the fading light of the evening. The cabin stood in the heart of the woods, isolated and silent, a perfect retreat from the relentless pace of city life. When I arrived, the sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the treetops. A soft breeze whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth. The cabin itself was modest, a rustic escape tucked away from the rest of the world. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just me, the quiet, and the vast wilderness surrounding me. It was exactly what I needed. A break from work, from the constant noise of urban life. The thought of spending a few days here, alone with my thoughts, was more than inviting, it was a necessity. I unpacked my things and made a simple dinner, the crackling fire in the hearth providing a comforting soundtrack to the growing darkness outside. As the flames danced in the fireplace, I felt the tension of the past few months begin to melt away. I stretched out on the couch, a worn-out paperback in hand, letting the fire's warmth soothe me. The only sounds were the wind rustling the trees and the occasional distant call of an owl. It wasn't until much later, as the fire died down and the room grew cold, that I decided to call it a night. I doused the remaining embers and made my way to the small bedroom, exhausted but content. The cabin creaked as the wind picked up, but it was nothing out of the ordinary, just the sounds of an old structure settling against the elements. I slipped under the thick blankets, welcoming the cozy warmth they offered. Outside, the wind continued to whistle through the trees, but it was distant and comforting, lulling me into a deep, dreamless sleep. Hours passed. The world outside remained still, save for the occasional creak of the cabin or the rustling of leaves in the night breeze. Then, at precisely 3:00 a.m., something changed. A loud, insistent knock echoed through the cabin. I jolted awake, my heart immediately pounding in my chest. For a moment, I lay completely still, unsure if the noise had been real or just a figment of a half-formed dream. I strained to listen, my breath caught in my throat, waiting, hoping it was nothing. The knock came again, louder this time, reverberating through the wooden walls of the cabin. I sat up, adrenaline flooding my veins as I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand. Fumbling with the switch, I cast the beam of light around the small bedroom. Shadows danced at the edges of the room, but everything was as it should be, except for the knocking. That relentless, deliberate knocking. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor, and crept toward the front door. The flashlight shook in my hand as I moved, every muscle in my body tense. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but the sound of my racing heart seemed deafening in the silence. "Hello," I called out, my voice wavering slightly. "Who's there?" No response. Only the steady, rhythmic knocking. Summoning all the courage I could muster, I approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. For a moment, I hesitated, debating whether I should open it or not. The knocking wasn't frantic, it was calm, methodical, as if whoever was on the other side wasn't in a rush, as though they knew I had no choice but to answer. Taking a deep breath, I peered through the peephole. Darkness greeted me, an impenetrable void broken only by the faint outline of trees swaying in the wind. No figure stood on the porch, no shadowy form visible in the dim moonlight. The knocking persisted, though, as steady as before. With a trembling hand, I unlocked the door and slowly cracked it open. The cold night air rushed in, sending a shiver down my spine. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the surroundings with the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness in all directions. There was no one there. No footprints in the dirt, no sign of movement in the shadows. The forest stretched out before me, silent and still, indifferent to my confusion and growing unease. "Is anyone there?" I called out again, this time more forcefully. My voice sounded strange in the quiet night, as if the trees themselves were absorbing the sound. Nothing, only silence. I quickly stepped back inside, locking the door behind me, my hands shaking. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Had it been an animal? A trick of the wind? Or was someone out there, lurking just beyond the reach of my flashlight? I checked all the windows, securing each one and making sure the locks were in place. Every creak, every gust of wind outside seemed magnified now, feeding into my growing paranoia. Sleep was out of the question. I returned to the bedroom, my heart still hammering in my chest, and sat on the edge of the bed, flashlight in hand, listening. The knocking did not return, but the memory of it lingered. My nerves were shot, every instinct screaming at me to stay alert, to be ready for something, though I didn't know what. The hours dragged on with me sitting there in the dark, waiting for the knock to come again, but it never did. Chiff! When dawn finally broke, casting a pale light through the cabin's windows, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The weight that had been pressing down on my chest all night lifted slightly, though my exhaustion was palpable. I stepped outside, blinking in the morning light, and scanned the area one last time. The clearing around the cabin was empty, just as it had been the night before. Had I imagined it all? I shook my head, trying to shake off the remnants of fear that clung to me. I wasn't imagining things. The knock had been real, and someone or something had been out there, but without any evidence, I couldn't be sure of what it was. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself, hiking through the surrounding woods and losing myself in the beauty of the forest. But even as I walked beneath the towering trees and breathed in the crisp mountain air, a part of me remained on edge. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush made me whip my head around, expecting to see someone or something following me. By the time night began to fall, I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. I knew I couldn't spend another sleepless night waiting for the knock to return, so I set up a camera on the porch, aimed at the front door, hoping to catch any sign of the nocturnal visitor. If the knocking came again, I would have proof. As the clock approached 3:00 a.m., I lay in bed, every muscle tense, listening for the knock. And it came. Right on cue, the loud, insistent knocking echoed through the cabin, just as it had the night before. My heart raced as I stared at the door, the sound relentless and unnerving. I grabbed my phone, eyes darting to the live camera feed, praying that I would see something, anything that would explain what was happening. But the porch remained empty. The camera showed nothing but the stillness of the night. The knocking continued, but there was no one there. Panic welled up inside me, and in a fit of desperation, I grabbed the flashlight and stormed to the door, flinging it open with more force than I intended. The knocking ceased abruptly, leaving only the echo of my pounding heart and the whisper of the wind. Once again, there was no one there. I shouted into the darkness, demanding answers from the unseen force that had tormented me for 2 nights. But the only response was the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, and the overwhelming silence. Defeated, I retreated into the cabin, locking the door behind me. Exhaustion finally overtook me, and I collapsed into bed, drifting into a restless sleep. When I left the cabin the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving something behind, something unresolved, a question unanswered, a fear unaddressed. The knocking may have stopped, but its memory would linger, haunting me long after I had driven away from the woods. Some mysteries, I realized, were never meant to be solved. Story 3. N. The shadow at the foot of the bed. Living alone in the city had its perks. My apartment, small and cozy, was my sanctuary, a place where I could unwind after long days at work and shut out the chaos of the outside world. It was on the 4th floor of an old building, tucked away on a quiet street lined with trees. The large windows let in plenty of natural light during the day, and at night, I could hear the faint hum of the city below, a comforting reminder that I was never truly alone. But that night, something felt different. I had come home exhausted from a long, grueling day at the office. After a quick dinner and a mindless TV show to unwind, I decided to head to bed early. The cool evening breeze drifted through the open window, carrying with it the familiar sounds of the city, distant car horns, the occasional murmur of voices from the street below. It was peaceful, the kind of background noise that usually lulled me into a deep, dreamless sleep. But something woke me that night. It was subtle at first, a strange feeling I couldn't quite place, a shift in the air, a sudden awareness that I was no longer alone in the room. My eyelids fluttered open, and for a moment I was disoriented, unsure if I was still dreaming or awake. The room was dimly lit, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight filtering through the curtains. And then I saw him, a man standing at the foot of my bed. For a split second, I couldn't move. My mind was struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. Was this real, or was I still dreaming? My heart began to race, the adrenaline kicking in as my body caught up to my mind. He was tall, with a shadowy figure that seemed almost surreal in the faint light. His features were obscured, but I could see the dark outline of his frame, standing perfectly still, just watching me. I screamed. The sound was shrill, piercing the silence of the night. It felt like the air was sucked out of the room as my voice echoed in the confined space. In an instant, the man bolted, disappearing into the darkness of the apartment. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, my body frozen with fear. The sound of his hurried footsteps echoed through the hallway, followed by the slam of the front door, and then silence. I stumbled out of bed, my legs shaking as I rushed to the door, locking it with trembling hands. My breath came in short, panic gasps, my mind racing to catch up with what had just happened. How had he gotten in? Who was he? And why had he been standing there watching me? I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. My voice quivered as I explained the situation to the dispatcher, telling her about the man, the way he had stood at the foot of my bed, and how he had fled when I screamed. "Stay on the line," she instructed, her voice calm but firm. "Officers are on their way. Make sure the door is locked, and don't open it for anyone except the police." I did as she said, retreating to the living room, where I could see the front door from across the room. My back pressed against the wall, I sat huddled on the floor, every creak and shadow amplified by my heightened senses. I could hear my pulse thundering in my ears, and every sound made me jump. Was he coming back? Had he been watching me for longer than I realized? The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every second dragged on, the silence suffocating. Then, finally, the distant wail of sirens reached my ears. I nearly cried with relief. A knock on the door made me jump, but a voice on the other side quickly reassured me. "It's the police." I unlocked the door with trembling fingers, and 2 officers stepped inside, their presence a comforting barrier against the lingering fear. One of them, a kind woman with a steady demeanor, guided me to the couch, asking me to recount what had happened in as much detail as I could. Her partner, a tall, serious man, began inspecting the apartment, checking every room and window. I told her everything, the way the man had been standing at the foot of my bed, the eerie stillness of his presence, how he had fled when I screamed. As I spoke, the reality of the situation sank in even deeper. Someone had been in my apartment while I slept. Someone had been watching me, standing just feet away from my bed. "We didn't find any sign of forced entry," the officer said when he returned from his search. "It doesn't look like anything's been taken, either." "No sign of forced entry," I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. "How did he get in?" The officer shook his head, his expression unreadable. "It's hard to say. You might want to check with your building's management tomorrow, see if they can replace your locks." That night passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. The officers stayed for a while, their presence a temporary balm for my frayed nerves, but even after they left, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I sat on the couch, my knees pulled to my chest, staring at the door, as if expecting the man to return at any moment. I replayed the scene over and over in my mind, searching for any detail I might have missed, something that would make sense of it all. Who was he? Why had he been there? And how long had he been watching me? By the time the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I had already made up my mind. I couldn't stay here not until I knew the locks had been changed, and not until I felt safe again. I called my best friend, Megan, who lived just a few blocks away. She arrived within minutes, wrapping me in a comforting hug the moment she stepped through the door. "You're staying with me tonight," she insisted. No arguments. Together, we went over every detail of what had happened, but no matter how many times I recounted the story, it didn't bring me any closer to an answer. The man who had stood at the foot of my bed remained a phantom, his identity and intentions a troubling mystery. Over the next few days, I took every precaution to secure my apartment. New locks were installed, and I set up a security system complete with motion sensors and cameras. Each new measure brought a small sense of peace, but the memory of that night lingered like a shadow in the back of my mind. I also spoke to my neighbors, warning them about the intruder and alerting them to what had happened. They were shocked and concerned, offering their own support and promising to keep an eye out for anything unusual. It was a small comfort to know that others were watching out for me, but the sense of violation, the knowledge that a stranger had been inside my home while I slept, was hard to shake. The police continued to investigate, but there were no leads. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind. Days turned into weeks, and though life gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy, I couldn't help but feel changed by the experience. I was more cautious now, more aware of my surroundings. Living alone, once a source of independence and freedom, now felt fraught with anxiety. Every creak of the apartment, every shadow outside the window set my nerves on edge, but I refused to let the fear consume me. The intruder had taken my sense of security, but he hadn't taken my resolve. I was determined to reclaim my home, to make it a sanctuary once again. Every night, as I locked the door and set the alarm, I reminded myself that I was stronger than the fear that had gripped me. The city outside hummed with life, a constant reminder that I was never truly alone. And within my small apartment, I began to rebuild my sense of safety one day at a time. Story 4. The diner and the note, "Don't look back." It was the third day of my road trip, and everything was going according to plan. I had carefully mapped out my route, selecting the most scenic byways and charming small towns to visit along the way. Rolling hills, lush forests, and quaint roadside stops dotted the landscape, making the trip feel more like an adventure than a simple journey. By noon, I found myself approaching a sleepy little town that seemed frozen in time. The kind of town where the streets were wide and empty, and the buildings looked like they hadn't changed in decades. As I drove down the main road, my stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since breakfast. I spotted a small diner up ahead, its neon sign flickering slightly, advertising hot coffee and homemade pies. Perfect. I pulled into the parking lot, gravel crunching under the tires as I slid into a spot near the entrance. The diner itself looked like something straight out of the 1950s checkered floors, red vinyl booths, and a jukebox in the corner that probably hadn't worked in years. It was charming in a nostalgic kind of way, a slice of Americana that felt comforting and familiar. As I stepped inside, the smell of frying bacon and freshly brewed coffee hit me, making my stomach rumble even louder. There were a few locals scattered throughout the diner, mostly older folks, their faces lined with years of stories and small town life. They nodded politely as I walked in, acknowledging my presence but not paying much attention. A friendly waitress greeted me with a warm smile, handing me a laminated menu that had clearly seen better days. I glanced over the options and settled on a classic burger and fries with a large coffee to keep me alert for the next leg of the drive. The waitress took my order and disappeared into the kitchen. As I waited, I couldn't help but take in the details of the diner. The walls were adorned with faded pictures of the town from decades past, old black and white photos of parades, town festivals, and proud business owners standing in front of their shops. It was the kind of place where nothing ever really changed, and in a way, that felt comforting. The hum of conversation from the few patrons and the clink of dishes from the kitchen filled the air with a pleasant rhythm. My food arrived quickly, and I dug in with gusto. The burger was delicious, the fries perfectly crispy, and the coffee strong enough to keep me going for hours. It was exactly what I needed. As I neared the end of my meal, I reached for my napkin, and that's when I noticed it. Tucked neatly under my plate was a small, folded piece of paper. I frowned, pulling it out and unfolding it slowly. The handwriting was messy, as if it had been written in a hurry, but the message was clear. 3 words, scrawled hastily in black ink. Don't look back. A chill ran down my spine, the words sending a ripple of unease through me. I stared at the note, my mind racing with questions. Who had left it? And why? I glanced around the diner, suddenly hyper-aware of my surroundings. The locals were still engrossed in their own conversations, oblivious to the note I held in my trembling hand. No one looked suspicious. No one even seemed to notice that I was there. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread that had settled over me. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe one of the patrons had left it as some kind of small-town prank, knowing I was an outsider passing through. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Very wrong. I finished my coffee, trying to keep my movements calm and steady. The note, now folded tightly in my fist, burned a hole in my pocket as I left a generous tip on the table and made my way to the register to pay. The waitress smiled as she handed me my change, but I barely heard her over the pounding of my heart in my chest. My mind was already focused on getting out of there. The sunlight outside seemed too bright, too harsh as I stepped into the parking lot. The warm breeze that had felt refreshing earlier now felt ominous, like something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I hurried to my car, glancing over my shoulder as I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. The note's message echoed in my mind, don't look back. I tossed my bag onto the passenger seat and started the engine, the familiar rumble of the car offering a small sense of comfort. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the nerves that had frayed in the last few minutes. As I pulled out of the parking lot and onto the road, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something or someone following me. But the road behind me was empty. No cars, no figures standing ominously in the distance. Just the diner, slowly fading from view as I drove away. Still, the feeling of unease didn't leave me. The note had unnerved me more than I wanted to admit, and the further I drove, the more I felt like something was wrong. Every time I checked the rearview mirror, I half expected to see a car trailing me, its headlights appearing suddenly out of nowhere, but there was nothing. Only the empty road stretching out behind me. As the hours passed and the landscape changed from the rural countryside to more familiar suburban sprawl, the tension in my chest began to loosen. The sun had started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows that flickered and danced at the edges of my vision. I was just beginning to relax when I saw it out of the corner of my eye, a flash of movement in the rearview mirror. My heart leapt into my throat. I whipped my head around, scanning the road behind me, but it was empty, completely empty. I forced a laugh, shaking my head at my own paranoia. The note had gotten to me. That was all. I was letting my imagination run wild, but even as I tried to dismiss it, the sense of being watched crept back, stronger than before. I turned on the radio, hoping some music would distract me from the growing unease that had settled in my bones. But as I flipped through the stations, every song seemed to carry an undertone of something sinister, and the static between stations felt like whispers in the dark. Then, I saw it again. Movement. In the rearview mirror. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing as I pulled over to the side of the road. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The road was dark now, illuminated only by the faint glow of my headlights. My breath came in shallow gasps as I turned around in my seat, scanning the road behind me. There was nothing there. No cars, no people, no sign of movement. But I knew what I had seen. For a few moments, I sat there, the car idling as I tried to calm my racing heart. The memory of the note was sharp in my mind. Don't look back. But why? Why had someone left it? And what were they trying to warn me about? I shook my head, forcing myself to keep moving. Sitting on the side of the road wasn't going to help. I needed to keep driving, to get home, and to put as much distance between myself and that diner as possible. I pulled back onto the road, the tension in my chest refusing to ease. The road ahead stretched out into the darkness, and for the rest of the drive, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every curve in the road, every shadow seemed to hold some hidden threat, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I was exhausted, mentally and physically drained. My hands trembled as I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. The familiar sight of my house should have been a comfort, but the weight of the note lingered. As I locked the front door behind me, I couldn't stop thinking about the note. Don't look back. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside had me on edge, my mind replaying the events of the day over and over. In the light of day, the fear seemed almost irrational, but the memory of the note and the tense drive home remained vivid, haunting me long after I had left that small town behind. I never found out who left the note or why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had been watching me that day. And I had listened. I hadn't looked back. Story 5. The Vanishing Man on the Graveyard Shift. Working the graveyard shift at the convenience store was usually a monotonous, quiet affair, the kind of shift where you could go hours without seeing another soul and the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead became your only company. The store sat on a lonely stretch of road, flanked by a few apartment buildings and a parking lot that was almost always empty at night. I was used to it, the eerie silence, the stillness, the feeling of isolation. But one particular night made me rethink everything I thought I knew about that quiet. It was just after 2 a.m., and the store was dead, as usual. The sound of the refrigeration units humming softly in the background, combined with the faint drone of a late-night talk show playing on the small TV above the counter, was the only noise breaking the stillness. I stood behind the counter, sipping on a cup of stale coffee, trying to keep myself awake. The night was dragging on, and all I could think about was the end of my shift. Then the front door chimed, signaling that someone had entered. Glancing up, I saw a man walk in. Tall, thin, and dressed in a long, dark coat that nearly brushed the floor. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face, making it impossible to see his features. Something about him immediately set me on edge. Maybe it was the way he moved, slow, deliberate, as if he was too calm for the time and place. Or maybe it was the way the shadow seemed to cling to him, almost like it followed him wherever he went. "A good evening," I called out, my voice echoing in the empty store. The man didn't respond. He moved silently through the aisles, his coat swaying slightly as he walked. I tried to shrug it off, assuming he didn't hear me or just didn't want to talk. Some people are like that, especially at this hour, but there was something about his presence that gnawed at me. I watched him out of the corner of my eye as he moved through the store, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't seem to be looking for anything in particular, just wandering. After a few minutes, I got busy with some restocking at the back of the store, but my mind stayed focused on him. A chill hung in the air that night, more than just the cold from the refrigerators. There was a sense of unease settling over me, something I couldn't shake. Eventually, I returned to the counter and glanced around, expecting to see him at the register, but he wasn't there. I hadn't heard the front door chime again, but the man was gone, just like that. The store was empty once more. Confused, I leaned forward on the counter, staring at the rows of shelves in the dimly lit store. Had he slipped out when I wasn't paying attention? But I always heard the door when it opened and closed, always. To ease my unease, I glanced up at the security monitor, something I did out of habit more than necessity. The store's security cameras captured every corner of the building, and I could see the feed on the small, grainy screen behind the counter. What I saw made my blood run cold. On the screen, the man was there. He had entered the store, his figure clearly visible as he moved down the aisles. But then, as he turned a corner near the back of the store, something impossible happened. He disappeared. And disappeared. One moment he was there, a shadowy figure gliding through the aisles, and the next, he was gone. No trace of him. No footsteps. No sign of his presence. He simply vanished into thin air. I rewound the footage, watching it again, convinced that I must have missed something, a glitch, maybe, or a problem with the cameras. But no, it was clear as day. The man had entered the store, wandered through the aisles, and then disappeared. The uneasy chill that had been gnawing at me all night suddenly grew sharper, more intense. My skin prickled, and I felt a wave of fear creep up my spine. I scanned the footage over and over, my eyes glued to the screen, desperate for some kind of rational explanation, but there was none. The man had vanished without a trace, leaving me alone in the silent, empty store. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this some kind of trick, a malfunction with the cameras? Or had I witnessed something far more sinister, something I couldn't explain? I glanced around the store again, half expecting to see him reappear out of the shadows, but there was nothing. The aisles were empty, bathed in the cold, sterile glow of the fluorescent lights. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the very walls of the store were closing in on me. Trying to shake off the fear that was rapidly taking over, I returned to the monitor and kept rewinding the footage. Over and over again, I watched as the man entered the store, moved down the aisles, and vanished. I couldn't stop watching, couldn't tear my eyes away from the impossible scene playing out on the screen. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline surging through my veins as I scanned the aisles once more, convinced that he was still in the store, hiding, watching me. It didn't help that the store was filled with dark corners, places where shadows lingered a little too long, places where the light didn't quite reach. I had never noticed how oppressive the quiet could be. The hum of the refrigeration units, once a comforting background noise, now felt like a dull, ominous drone. I moved restlessly behind the counter, checking the clock every few minutes, praying for my shift to end. My eyes kept darting to the corners of the store, to the aisles where the man had vanished, as if expecting him to step out of the shadows at any moment. And then the door chimed again. I flinched, my heart leaping into my throat as I looked up, but it wasn't him. Instead, it was a familiar face, an elderly man who lived down the street and came in every night for his usual pack of cigarettes and a newspaper. "Quiet night?" he asked, his voice calm, oblivious to the fear still gripping me. "Yeah, you could say that," I replied, forcing a shaky smile as I rang up his items. My hands trembled slightly as I handed him his change. The old man glanced at me, his brow furrowed in concern. "You all right? You look a little pale." I hesitated, unsure of how to explain what had just happened. How could I tell him that I'd watched a man vanish into thin air, that I had spent the last hour haunted by shadows and silence? I didn't want to sound insane. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said, forcing another smile. "Just a long night." The old man chuckled, shaking his head. "These graveyard shifts can get to you, play tricks on your mind when you're all alone." I nodded, though his words didn't bring much comfort. After he left, I stood behind the counter, staring at the empty aisles once again. The unease was still there, crawling just beneath my skin. The shadows seemed to linger a little longer than they should, and every creak, every rustle set my nerves on edge. When my shift finally ended, and the first light of dawn began to creep through the store's front windows, I breathed a sigh of relief. I grabbed my jacket and hurried out of the store, eager to leave the oppressive atmosphere behind. But the memory of that night lingered long after I walked out the door. The image of the man vanishing into thin air replayed in my mind over and over again, a puzzle with no solution, a mystery that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. For weeks after, I kept glancing at the security monitors, half expecting to see him again, lurking in the shadows, but he never returned. He was a fleeting ghost in the memories of that one unsettling night, a reminder that even in the most mundane places, the unknown can always be lurking just beyond the edge of perception. Story 6. Well, the abandoned building and the mysterious occupant. There's a strange allure to abandoned buildings. Something about their silent halls and crumbling facades speaks of forgotten stories, long-lost secrets, and a haunting sense of mystery. Maybe that's why my friends and I had always been drawn to them, those hidden, decaying structures that seem to exist outside of time. We had talked for months about exploring the old building on the edge of town, and finally one warm Saturday afternoon we decided to do it. The building had stood for decades, its weathered brickwork and boarded-up windows a testament to a bygone era. It loomed at the edge of the woods, partially hidden by towering pines, casting long shadows across the overgrown path that led up to its entrance. From a distance, it seemed peaceful, almost inviting in a way. But as we got closer, its true nature revealed itself. The air around it felt different, heavier, and I could sense an undercurrent of tension building within our group. Jake, Lily, and I had gathered our gear, flashlights, cameras, and backpacks filled with snacks and water and set off toward the building. The excitement in Jake's voice was palpable, but there was a tinge of nervousness there too. Even Lily, who was usually the most eager for these kinds of adventures, seemed a little more reserved than usual. As we approached the building, we stood in silence for a moment, taking it all in. The structure seemed to loom over us, its once grand entrance now partially obscured by debris and overgrown vines. There was a gaping hole where the front door had once been, a jagged tear in the building's facade that led into darkness. "Are you sure about this?" Lily asked, her voice tinged with nervous excitement. She wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, but even she could sense that there was something off about this place. "Yeah, what's the worst that could happen?" Jake replied, grinning as he slung his backpack over his shoulder. "It's just an old building." I nodded, trying to mask my own apprehension. "We've talked about this for months. We can't back out now." We squeezed through the gap in the boards that blocked the entrance and stepped in. Immediately, the temperature dropped a few degrees and the musty scent of decay filled the air. Dust hung thickly, illuminated by the slivers of sunlight that managed to penetrate the boarded windows. The floor was littered with remnants of the past, discarded furniture, tattered books, rusted metal fragments, and old newspapers yellowed with age. The interior was as haunting as the exterior, with its cracked walls and peeling paint telling stories of a time long gone. Our footsteps echoed in the vast, empty halls, each creak of the floorboard sending a shiver down my spine. We moved cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. Every now and then, we would stop to take pictures, marveling at the eerie beauty of the derelict surroundings. There was something both fascinating and unsettling about exploring a place like this, a place that had once been full of life but was now abandoned, forgotten, and decaying. The deeper we ventured into the building, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and every sound seemed to amplify in the stillness. I could feel the tension growing between us, though no one said anything. We were all on edge, our excitement now mingled with a sense of unease that we couldn't shake. Then, we found it. A large room at the end of a long corridor. It appeared to have been some kind of common area once, with faded paintings on the walls and an old piano in the corner, its keys yellowed with age. But it wasn't the room itself that caught our attention. It was what we found inside. In one corner of the room, near a broken window, was a neatly laid out sleeping bag. Next to it was a small stack of canned food, a half-empty water bottle, and a worn-out backpack leaning against the wall. A makeshift camp, tucked away in the ruins of this forgotten building. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. "Guys, look at this," I whispered, pointing to the scene in front of us. Jake and Lily turned, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern as they took in the sight. The sleeping bag, the food, the backpack, it was all fresh. Someone had been living here, and recently. "Do you think someone's still here?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake frowned, his eyes scanning the room. "Looks like it," he muttered. "We should be careful." Suddenly, the excitement of exploring the building was replaced by a sense of dread. This wasn't just an abandoned building anymore, it was someone's home, and we were trespassing. We decided to continue our exploration, but the discovery had changed everything. Our steps were quieter now, our movements more cautious. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant noise set us on edge. The building felt different now, no longer just a forgotten relic of the past, but a place where someone else had been, someone who might still be here. As we made our way through the dark, winding hallways, we found more evidence of recent habitation. Empty food wrappers, a worn jacket draped over a chair, a flashlight with fresh batteries. Whoever had been staying here had made themselves comfortable. The thought gnawed at me, making the building feel increasingly claustrophobic. And then we heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the hallway behind us. We froze, exchanging fearful glances. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could see the same fear reflected in Jake and Lily's eyes. "Someone's following us," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Without another word, we turned and bolted. Our footsteps pounded in sync with the ones behind us as we raced through the twisting hallways, desperate to find our way out. The air around us seemed to close in, thick with panic, as the sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer. The exit loomed ahead, a small sliver of daylight shining through the gap in the boards. We scrambled toward it, squeezing through as fast as we could, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We didn't stop running until we were a good distance from the building, collapsing onto the grass in a heap of nerves and exhaustion. I glanced back at the building, its crumbling facade now bathed in the warm light of the setting sun. It looked innocent enough from here, silent and still, but I knew better. "Did you see who it was?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. Jake shook his head, still catching his breath. "No, I just heard them." We sat in silence for a while, trying to process what had just happened. The building, once a symbol of adventure and excitement, had become something far more sinister. We had gone in search of mystery, and we had found it, but not in the way we had expected. We knew we had to report what we'd found. We couldn't just leave it, not when someone was living there, hidden away in the shadows. So we called the local authorities, telling them about the makeshift camp and the footsteps that had chased us out. They promised to investigate, but we never heard any updates. The building remained abandoned, its secrets and inhabitants shrouded in mystery. Our experience became a cautionary tale among our friends, a reminder of the unseen dangers that can lurk in forgotten places. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that we were being watched that day, that whoever had made that building their home had seen us, followed us, and let us go this time. But I'll never go back. Story 7. The threatening note at the apartment. There's something comforting about the predictability of everyday life. You wake up, go through your routine, and return to the safety of your home, where everything feels familiar and secure. For me, that security had always been my small, one-bedroom apartment. It wasn't anything special, but it was mine, a place where I could unwind after work and shut out the world. That sense of security vanished the day I found the note. It started like any other morning. The sun was barely rising, casting a soft golden light through the blinds as I made my way out the door, coffee in hand and keys jangling as I locked up. My apartment complex was a quiet one, tucked away on the edge of town, with mostly young professionals and older retirees as my neighbors. I rarely saw anyone except in passing, a friendly nod here and there, but I liked it that way, quiet, predictable. As I turned to leave for work, something caught my eye, a small, folded piece of paper taped to my front door. At first, I thought it was some kind of advertisement or maybe a notice from the apartment management, but as I unfolded it, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The note was handwritten, the letters jagged and uneven, like they'd been scribbled in a hurry. But it wasn't the handwriting that made my blood run cold. It was the message. You don't belong here. Leave before it's too late. I stood frozen on my doorstep, rereading the note over and over again, my mind struggling to process the words. It didn't make sense. Why would someone leave this? And why target me? I had lived in the apartment for over 2 years without any issues, barely even interacting with my neighbors. A surge of fear crept up my spine. Was this some kind of prank, a sick joke, or was it serious? I glanced around, my eyes scanning the quiet complex, but everything looked normal. The usual cars were parked in their spots. The trees swayed gently in the morning breeze, and no one else seemed to be around. It was eerily calm, as if the world hadn't yet woken up to the threat I had just discovered. With trembling hands, I stuffed the note into my pocket and headed to my car, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that clung to me. I couldn't let it ruin my day. It was probably nothing, just some kid playing a prank, or maybe someone had left the note on the wrong door by mistake. That's what I told myself as I drove to work, though the words echoed in my mind the entire time. You don't belong here. Leave before it's too late. By the time I arrived at the office, I had convinced myself it wasn't worth worrying about. I pushed the thought to the back of my mind, trying to focus on the mountain of paperwork that awaited me. But every time I took a break, every moment of quiet was filled with the memory of that note. My mind kept wandering back to it, replaying the moment I had found it, the unsettling feeling that had washed over me. When I got home that evening, I was on edge. I told myself not to be paranoid, that the note was nothing, but a small part of me was still tense, waiting for something to happen. I checked the door carefully as I unlocked it, half expecting another note, but there was nothing. The apartment was just as I had left it, quiet and undisturbed. Still, the sense of unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, that someone knew I had found the note and was waiting to see what I'd do next. I locked the door behind me, double-checking the bolt before settling in for the night. I kept glancing at the windows, making sure the curtains were drawn, my ears straining for any unusual sounds. The usual comfort of my home felt hollow, like the walls were too thin, like anyone could be lurking just outside. The next few days passed uneventfully. I went about my routine work, groceries, dinner, bed, but the sense of being watched never left me. Every time I left my apartment, I would glance around nervously, scanning the parking lot and the hallways for any signs of the person who had left the note. But there was never anyone there. It was as if the entire complex had become a ghost town, and I was the only one left. Then, one night, something happened that made my worst fears come true. It was late, and I was getting ready for bed. The apartment was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the building settling and the distant hum of traffic from the highway. I had just finished brushing my teeth when I heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound. A knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. It was after midnight. Who would be knocking at my door at this hour? I stood frozen in the bathroom, my toothbrush still in my hand, straining to listen. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the building making noise or a neighbor passing by. Then it came again. Louder this time. Knock. Knock. My pulse quickened, fear gripping me as I crept toward the front door, my bare feet silent on the carpet. I glanced through the peephole, but all I could see was darkness. Whoever was knocking had positioned themselves just out of view. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. No answer. My hand hovered over the door handle, every instinct screaming at me not to open it. I didn't know who or what was on the other side, but I knew it wasn't good. My mind raced back to the note, the warning scrawled in jagged handwriting. Leave before it's too late. Was this what they meant? Was this the threat they had warned me about? I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't someone I knew. It was something else, something darker. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The operator answered quickly, her voice calm and professional, but I could barely get the words out. "There's someone at my door," I whispered, my eyes glued to the front entrance. "I don't know who they are, but they've been knocking. They left a note a few days ago. It said I should leave." The operator stayed on the line with me, asking me questions, trying to keep me calm as I waited for the police. I kept my eyes on the door the entire time, the knocks still echoing in my ears. But just as suddenly as they had started, the knocks stopped. Silence fell over the apartment, thick and oppressive. I waited, my breath shallow, straining to hear any sign of movement outside, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just silence. When the police arrived a few minutes later, I opened the door cautiously, explaining everything that had happened. They searched the area thoroughly, but they found no one. No sign of the person who had been knocking, no indication of where they had gone. Could have been a prank, one of the officers suggested, though I could see the doubt in his eyes, but we'll keep an eye out. If anything else happens, call us immediately. After they left, I sat on the couch, staring at the door, my thoughts racing. Was it really just a prank? Or was someone really trying to scare me to make me leave? The note had said to leave before it was too late, but what did that mean? What was supposed to happen if I stayed? I didn't sleep that night. I kept every light on, my phone clutched in my hand, waiting for anything to happen. But the rest of the night passed in an eerie stillness, the knocks and the note haunting my every thought. Days turned into weeks, and though nothing else happened, the fear never left me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching, waiting for me to leave. I kept the note hidden away in a drawer, but its message lingered in my mind every day. "You don't belong here. Leave before it's too late, Dot." I never found out who left it, or who had been knocking on my door that night, but I couldn't stay in the apartment much longer. The fear had become too much. I packed up and moved within the month, leaving the apartment and its strange mystery behind. But even now, in my new place, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, half expecting to hear that knock again. Story 8. The cry for help in the wilderness. The forest had always been a place of solace for me, a sanctuary where I could escape the chaos of everyday life. It was quiet, vast, and untouched by the noise of the modern world. That's why I had decided to go on this solo camping trip. No distractions, no people, just me, the trees, and the open sky. It had been a long week at work, and I needed this time to think, to breathe, and to be completely alone with my thoughts. I had set up camp deep in the wilderness, miles from the nearest trailhead. I liked it that way. No other campers, no signs of civilization, just the whisper of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves as small animals scurried by. The air was crisp and cool, the scent of pine heavy in the air, and the only light came from the flickering flames of the campfire I had built. As the evening turned to night, the temperature dropped, but the fire kept me warm as I sat by it, sipping on some tea and staring up at the stars. The forest was silent now, save for the occasional crackle of the fire. I had never felt so at peace, so completely at one with nature. It was perfect. But that peace didn't last. It was around midnight when I heard it for the first time, a faint, distant cry carried on the wind. "Help! Help me!" I froze, my heart skipping a beat as the sound registered in my mind. At first, I thought I had imagined it. I had been lost in thought, my mind wandering, and maybe the wind had played tricks on me. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. "Help me. It was a woman's voice, soft and desperate, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. My mind raced. Who could it be? I was miles away from the nearest trail, and I hadn't seen another person since I'd left my car at the trailhead earlier that day. The chances of someone being out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this hour seemed slim. But the voice, it was real. Someone was out there. I grabbed my flashlight, my pulse quickening as I stood up and listened. The voice came again, faint and pleading. "Please, help." I couldn't just ignore it. Someone needed help. I turned on the flashlight and shined it into the darkness, trying to pinpoint the direction of the voice. The beam of light cut through the thick trees, but the forest swallowed it up, leaving me with only shadows and the distant sound of the woman's cries. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. "Where are you?" There was no immediate response. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear anything, footsteps, rustling, anything that would guide me to the source of the voice. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the cry came again. "Please, help." It was closer now, but still distant, as if the woman was struggling to move. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Grabbing my jacket and my flashlight, I set off into the woods, following the sound. The beam of the flashlight bounced off the trees, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to shift and move as I walked. Every step I took felt heavier, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The voice continued, leading me deeper into the forest. Help me, please. My mind raced with possibilities. Had she gotten lost? Injured? Was she hurt and unable to find her way back to the trail? The more I thought about it, the more my sense of urgency grew. I quickened my pace, calling out every few minutes to let her know I was coming. "I'm here," I shouted. "I'm coming to help." But the voice never answered me directly. It just kept calling out, repeating the same desperate plea over and over. "Please, help me." I had been walking for what felt like half an hour, deeper into the woods than I had ever intended to go. The trees were thicker here, the undergrowth more tangled, and the path ahead was harder to navigate. My flashlight flickered as the battery began to weaken, and I cursed myself for not bringing extra batteries. The voice, though, kept calling. "Help me." It was closer now. I was sure of it. I pressed on, the cold night air biting at my skin, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The forest seemed darker here, more oppressive, and the sense of unease that had been gnawing at me since I'd first heard the voice was now a full-blown wave of dread. Something didn't feel right. I stopped for a moment, turning off the flashlight to conserve what little power it had left. I stood in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the forest. But there was nothing, just an eerie, suffocating silence. The voice had stopped. "Hello," I called out again, my voice trembling. "Where are you?" No answer. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I stood there, my eyes straining to see in the darkness. Had she found help? Had she stopped calling because she was safe? Or had something happened to her? Suddenly, the cry came again, but this time it was different, louder, closer, too close. "Help me." It was directly behind me. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand as I frantically scanned the trees behind me, but there was nothing there. No one, just the dark, empty forest. My heart raced, panic flooding my senses. Something was wrong. This wasn't right. The voice shouldn't have been this close. There was no way she could have moved so quickly. No way she could have been behind me without me hearing her approach. I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering as the last of its battery drained away. The darkness closed in around me, and I felt a cold chill wash over me, one that had nothing to do with the night air. "Help me." The voice came again, but it wasn't a cry anymore. It was a whisper, soft and menacing, curling around me like smoke. "Please, help." My instinct screamed at me to run. I turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush as fast as I could, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sprinted back the way I had come. The voice echoed behind me, louder now, as if it was following me. "Help me, help me, help me." I ran faster, my heart pounding in my ears, my legs burning as I pushed through the dense forest. Branches scratched at my skin, the darkness closing in around me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The voice was getting closer, almost on top of me now. Then, suddenly it stopped. The forest was silent again. No voice, no footsteps. Just the sound of my labored breathing and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. I slowed down, glancing over my shoulder, but there was no one there. The darkness stretched out behind me, endless and empty. I had no idea how far I had run or how far I was from camp, but I didn't care. I just needed to get back. I stumbled through the trees, my legs trembling with exhaustion, until finally, I saw the faint glow of my campfire in the distance. Relief flooded through me as I reached the clearing, collapsing onto the ground next to the fire, my body shaking with adrenaline. For a long time, I just sat there staring into the flames, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The voice, the chase, the way it had seemed to follow me. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. Whoever or whatever had been calling for help wasn't human. I knew that now. It had been something else, something that wanted me to follow it, something that had been waiting for me in the woods. The next morning, I packed up my gear and left the campsite without a second thought. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. I never went camping alone again. Story 9. The stranded car and the figure in the distance. The road stretched out before me, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through the barren landscape. The sky was a muted gray, the kind of overcast that made the world feel dull and lifeless. I had been driving for hours, my GPS leading me down back roads to avoid traffic on the highways. At first, The solitude of the countryside had been refreshing, a break from the constant hum of city life. But as the miles ticked by and the sun began its slow descent behind the clouds, the isolation became unsettling. There wasn't another car in sight. No houses, no buildings, just miles of open fields and the occasional cluster of trees dotting the horizon. It was one of those roads where you don't pass a single gas station or rest stop for miles. And as luck would have it, that's exactly when my car began to overheat. I noticed the needle on the temperature gauge climbing higher and higher. At first, I tried to ignore it, hoping it was just a momentary glitch. But when steam started rising from the hood, I knew I couldn't keep driving. I cursed under my breath and pulled off to the side of the road, the gravel crunching beneath my tires as I came to a stop. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the steam billowing from the engine, trying to figure out what to do. My phone was on the passenger seat, but I already knew there wouldn't be any service out here. I was in the middle of nowhere. No signal, no gas station in sight, and now no car. Great, I muttered, slamming the steering wheel in frustration. I got out of the car and popped the hood, wincing as the heat hit me in the face. The radiator was shot, overheated and leaking. There was no way I was going anywhere without help. I pulled out my phone, but as expected, the no service symbol blinked back at me. I stood there for a moment, listening to the eerie silence of the countryside. The wind whispered through the tall grass on either side of the road. But other than that, there was nothing. No distant hum of traffic, no birds chirping, just silence. The kind of silence that made your skin crawl. That's when I saw it. In the distance, down the road, there was a figure. At first, I thought I was imagining it just a trick of the light or maybe the steam from the engine messing with my vision. But no, there was definitely someone there. They were far away, little more than a dark shape against the gray sky, standing still on the side of the road. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but the figure didn't move, just stood there, facing my direction. My heart skipped a beat. Maybe they could help. Maybe they lived nearby and had a phone with service, or at the very least, could give me a ride to the nearest town. I raised my hand and waved, calling out, "Hey, excuse me, can you help?" No response. The figure remained still, like a statue, unmoving and silent. I frowned, taking a few steps away from my car, keeping my eyes locked on the distant shape. "Hello," I called again, louder this time. "My car's broken down. Can you help?" Nothing. Shathing. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Something about the figure's stillness, the way they just stood there watching, made my skin prickle with unease. There was no way they hadn't heard me. The road was empty, and quiet my voice should have carried easily. But they didn't move. Didn't acknowledge me. I hesitated. Should I walk toward them? Maybe they were hurt, or maybe they didn't hear me after all. But something in my gut told me to stay put. The longer I stared at the figure, the more uneasy I felt. They were just wrong. Something about their posture, the way they were standing, too rigid, too unnatural. I took a step back toward my car, keeping my eyes on the figure. But then, something strange happened. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the figure began to move. They didn't walk, didn't run. They just glided forward, their movements smooth and unsettling. My heart leapt into my throat as I watched them grow closer, their dark silhouette becoming clearer with every passing second. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing. This wasn't right. No one moved like that. No one glided like that. "Hey," I shouted, more out of fear than anything else. "Stay back." The figure didn't stop, didn't slow down, just kept coming. I turned and ran back to my car, slamming the door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. My breath came in short, panic gasps as I glanced in the rearview mirror, my eyes darting back to the figure, but they were gone. The road was empty. I blinked, staring at the stretch of asphalt behind me. How could they have disappeared? They had been right there coming toward me, and now, nothing, just an empty road stretching out into the distance. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The figure had vanished as quickly as they had appeared. I sat there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe I was dehydrated, or maybe the stress of the car breaking down was making me see things. But even as I tried to rationalize it, the fear wouldn't leave me. I glanced at my phone again, hoping for even the faintest signal, but it was still dead. No service. I was stranded, alone, and now I wasn't sure if I was really alone at all. I debated getting out of the car again, but every instinct screamed at me to stay inside. I locked the doors and sat back, staring out at the empty road, waiting. For what? I wasn't sure. Part of me hoped another car would come by, someone who could help, but a darker part of me feared that the figure would return, that they were still out there, watching, waiting for me to step outside. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The sun sank lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. The world around me seemed to grow darker, colder. As the daylight faded, I kept my eyes on the road, half expecting the figure to reappear at any moment, but they didn't. Eventually, as the last light of day slipped below the horizon, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here all night. Not with that thing out there. I grabbed my backpack from the passenger seat, packed with some water, snacks, and a flashlight, and took a deep breath. I had no choice. I had to walk. There was no telling how far the nearest town was, but it was better than staying in the car, waiting for something worse to happen. As I opened the door and stepped out onto the road, the cool night air hit me like a slap in the face. The silence was deafening. No crickets, no birds, no sound at all. Just the wind, soft and slow, rustling through the tall grass. I turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the growing darkness, and began walking down the road. Every step felt heavy, my legs tense with fear. My heart pounded in my chest, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following me again. But there was nothing. The road remained empty, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. I walked for what felt like hours, my flashlight flickering as the batteries began to die. The road stretched on endlessly with no sign of civilization in sight. My throat was dry, my feet ached, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't go back. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A small, faint light far down the road, barely visible through the trees. Relief flooded through me. It had to be a house or a gas station or something, anything that could offer help. I quickened my pace, my heart racing with hope. But as I drew closer, the light flickered. And then it went out. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The road ahead was plunged into darkness once more, and the sinking feeling returned. Something wasn't right. I shone my flashlight toward where the light had been, but the beam barely cut through the thick night air. Then, from the shadows, I heard it. A soft, distant voice. "Help me." I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was my voice. Story 10. The Babysitter and the Stranger at the Door. Babysitting wasn't something I did often, but when my friend Sarah called in a panic, asking if I could cover for her last minute, I couldn't say no. She had promised me it would be an easy night. The baby, Maddie, had already been put to bed, and all I needed to do was hang out for a few hours until the parents got home. Easy money, right? When I arrived at the house, it was just after 8 p.m., and the neighborhood was already quiet. It was one of those cookie-cutter suburban developments where every house looks the same. The lawns are perfectly manicured, and the streets are lined with identical trees. The only thing that set the houses apart were the numbers on the doors. Sarah gave me a quick rundown before leaving a tour of the house, the location of the baby monitor, and a reminder that Maddie was a great sleeper and rarely woke up once she was down. I smiled, reassured. I'd babysat before, but never for a baby so young. Maddie was only 6 months old, but Sarah insisted that she was no trouble at all. After Sarah left, the house felt impossibly quiet, the kind of quiet that amplifies every little sound: the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, the distant murmur of the baby monitor on the coffee table. I settled onto the couch with my phone, scrolling mindlessly through social media while keeping one ear on the monitor, listening for any sign that Maddie had woken up. Time passed slowly, the minutes dragging on as I switched from my phone to the TV. I flipped through channels, but nothing could hold my attention for long. The stillness of the house felt strange, almost unnatural. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I knew I was alone. Then, just after 10 p.m., there was a knock at the door. It was so faint at first that I wasn't even sure I had heard it. I muted the TV and sat up, straining to listen. A few seconds passed, and then it came again, this time louder, more deliberate. Knock, knock. I frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late, too late for a visitor. My heart began to race, the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at me all evening suddenly intensifying. I didn't know anyone in this neighborhood, and Sarah hadn't mentioned expecting anyone. I stood up slowly, my eyes fixed on the front door. The house was so quiet that the sound of my own footsteps seemed unnaturally loud as I crossed the room. I peeked through the peephole. but all I could see was the shadowed outline of someone standing on the porch. Whoever it was, they weren't moving. A knot of fear tightened in my stomach. Every horror story I had ever heard about babysitting flashed through my mind in an instant, but I tried to calm myself. It was probably just a neighbor or someone who had the wrong house. There was no reason to panic. But I couldn't bring myself to open the door. Instead, I called out, "Who's there?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, a man's voice, low and unfamiliar, responded, "Is Sarah home?" My heart skipped a beat. The man's voice was calm, almost too calm, and something about the way he asked the question made my skin crawl. "No, she's not," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "She's out right now. Can I help you?" There was another long pause, and I felt my pulse quicken. The figure on the porch shifted slightly, and I could hear the faint sound of his shoes scraping against the concrete. Then, finally, he spoke again. "I'm an old friend. I just wanted to check in on her." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. I didn't know all of Sarah's friends, but this man's voice was unfamiliar, and the fact that he had shown up so late, unannounced, set off alarm bells in my head. "I think you have the wrong house," I said, my voice firmer now. "Sarah didn't mention anyone coming by tonight." There was another pause, longer this time, and I could feel the tension mounting. My mind raced, trying to decide what to do. Should I call Sarah? Should I call the police? Should I just ignore him and hope he left? But then the man spoke again, his voice even lower than before. "Can I come in? Just for a minute?" Panic surged through me. Every instinct screamed at me to get away from the door, to lock every window, every entrance, and hide. I took a step back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "No," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "I'm sorry, but you need to leave." For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence. The man didn't respond, didn't move. I stood frozen, my eyes locked on the door, waiting for something to happen. Then, without warning, the doorknob turned. I gasped, stumbling backward as the knob twisted violently in his hand. He was trying to get in. The door rattled as he tugged on it, the sound sending a jolt of terror through me. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, my mind racing. I had to call the police. Now. But just as suddenly as it had started, the rattling stopped. The doorknob stilled, and the house was plunged into an eerie, oppressive silence. I stood there, clutching my phone in trembling hands, waiting for him to try again. But nothing happened. No more knocking, no more rattling, just silence. I crept back toward the door, my legs shaking beneath me. I pressed my ear to the wood, listening for any sound of movement outside. But the porch was quiet, too quiet. Slowly, cautiously, I peeked through the peephole again. The man was gone. I let out a shaky breath, my entire body trembling with adrenaline. I didn't know where he had gone or why he had left, but I wasn't about to take any chances. I locked the door, checked all the windows, and made sure every possible entrance was secured. Then I grabbed my phone and called Sarah. The phone rang twice before she picked up, her voice groggy from sleep. "Hey, what's up?" I tried to keep my voice calm, but the fear was still thick in my throat. "Sarah, some guy just came to the door. He said he was an old friend of yours." But I didn't recognize his voice. "He tried to get in." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought the call had dropped. Then, Sarah's voice came through, sharper now, wide awake. What did he look like? I didn't see his face. He was standing in the shadows, but he sounded off. Something about him wasn't right. I told him to leave, but then he tried to open the door. Sarah was quiet for a moment before she spoke again, her voice low and serious. "I don't have any friends who would come by at this time. Are you okay? Is the door locked?" "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Everything's locked." "Good. Stay inside. I'm calling the police." After hanging up with Sarah, I paced the living room, every sound making me jump. My eyes darted toward the windows, half expecting to see the man standing outside, watching, waiting for another chance to get in. But the minutes passed, and he didn't return. It felt like hours before the police arrived. When they did, they searched the property, but there was no sign of the man, no footprints, no disturbed grass, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. They assured me that they would patrol the area and keep an eye out, but without any leads, there wasn't much they could do. Sarah and her husband came home not long after, and despite their reassurances that everything would be fine, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Who was that man? Why had he tried to get in? And why had he chosen this house? I never got any answers. But from that night on, I couldn't babysit again. The memory of that man, his voice, the way he had tried to open the door, the way he had vanished haunted me for weeks. Even now, whenever I'm home alone at night, I find myself checking the locks over and over, listening for that faint knock, terrified that one day he'll come back. Story 11. AIM. The roadside motel and the missing key. There's something unsettling about roadside motels. They're designed for transients, for people who pass through, sleep for a night, and disappear by morning. I had never been particularly fond of them, but after driving for nearly 12 hours straight on a desolate highway, I didn't have much choice. My eyes were burning with exhaustion, the lines on the road blurring together, and I knew I couldn't go any further. The sun had already set, leaving the sky a deep shade of indigo as I pulled off the highway and into the parking lot of the first motel I saw. It was a small, run-down place, its neon sign flickering in and out of life. Vacancy, it read, though the letters were faded and cracked, barely visible in the dim light. I parked the car and stepped out, my legs stiff from the long drive. The air was cooler here, with a biting chill that hinted at the late hour. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a couple of other cars parked near the entrance. The place looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, the kind of motel where the wallpaper is peeling and the bedspreads are stained with the memories of travelers long gone. I grabbed my overnight bag from the car and headed toward the front office. Inside, the faint buzz of a fluorescent light greeted me, and behind the desk sat an elderly man, his skin weathered and lined with age. He didn't look up as I approached, his attention fixed on an old black and white television playing static in the corner. Hi, I said, my voice echoing in the small room. I need a room for the night. The man grunted in acknowledgement, still not looking up. He moved slowly, grabbing a key from the wall behind him and slapping it on the counter without a word. I glanced down at it, room 12. The key was attached to a large, worn-out plastic fob with the room number written in faded marker. How much, I asked. 40, the man replied gruffly, finally lifting his eyes to meet mine. His gaze was dull, almost bored, as if he had seen 1,000 people like me walk through that door, and he didn't care about any of them. I handed him the cash, took the key, and left the office without another word. As I stepped back outside, the cold night air hit me again, and I shivered. The motel seemed even more deserted now, the silence heavy and oppressive. I glanced around the parking lot, but there was no one else in sight, just my car and 2 others sitting like silent sentinels under the dim glow of the streetlights. I made my way down the row of doors, counting until I reached room 12. The door was old and scratched, the paint chipped away from years of neglect. I slipped the key into the lock and turned it with a satisfying click, pushing the door open to reveal a dimly lit room. It was exactly what I had expected, cheap, outdated, and slightly musty. The bedspread was an ugly floral pattern that looked like it hadn't been washed in years, and the carpet was threadbare in places. There was a small TV sitting on a dresser across from the bed, and a rickety chair in the corner. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, revealing a cracked mirror and a yellowed shower curtain. But I didn't care. I was too tired to be picky. All I needed was a few hours of sleep before I hit the road again in the morning. I locked the door behind me, tossed my bag onto the chair, and collapsed onto the bed. The springs creaked under my weight, but I didn't care. I was exhausted, and sleep was all I could think about. I kicked off my shoes, closed my eyes, and let the silence of the room envelop me. But sleep didn't come as easily as I had hoped. I lay there in the dark, my mind racing with the events of the day, the strange isolation of the motel gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The quiet was too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes every creak of the building, every distant sound seem amplified. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared up at the ceiling, willing myself to relax. Then I heard it. A soft knock at the door. It was faint, almost hesitant, as if someone was testing the waters, unsure of whether they should be knocking at all. I froze, my body tensing as I stared at the door from across the room. Who would be knocking at this hour? I hadn't seen anyone else around, and the idea of someone coming to my room in the middle of the night sent a chill down my spine. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, pretending I hadn't heard. Maybe they'd go away if I didn't respond. But then the knock came again, louder this time. Knock. 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 I sat up slowly, my heart racing. Hello, I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I stood up, my bare feet sinking into the worn carpet as I made my way toward the door. I hesitated for a moment, then peered through the peephole. The hallway outside was empty. Confused, I unlocked the door and opened it a crack, glancing up and down the row of rooms. There was no one there. The night was still, the parking lot deserted, just like it had been when I arrived. I stepped outside, looking around, but I didn't see a soul. A cold breeze swept through the parking lot, making me shiver. I quickly retreated back into the room, locking the door behind me. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Who had knocked on my door? And why would they disappear without a word? I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably just some other guest who had gotten the wrong room. Maybe they had realized their mistake and left. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The knock had been too deliberate, too strange. I sat back down on the bed, trying to calm my nerves. The room felt colder now, the air heavy with an unsettling tension. I glanced at the clock. Midnight. I needed to sleep. I had a long drive ahead of me in the morning, and I couldn't afford to be exhausted. But sleep wouldn't come. The minutes ticked by, and the silence grew more oppressive with each passing second. My mind raced, replaying the sound of the knock over and over again. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then I heard it again. The soft click of the doorknob turning. My blood ran cold as I stared at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The knob twisted slowly, as if someone was trying to open it from the other side, but the door was locked. Whoever it was couldn't get in. I jumped up from the bed, rushing to the door and pressing my back against it, holding the lock in place. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. The doorknob stopped moving, and the room fell silent once more. For a moment, I stood there, my back pressed against the door, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I was terrified. My mind raced with possibilities. Who was trying to get into my room, and why? I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my hand shaking as I dialed the number for the front desk. The phone rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. I hung up and dialed again, but there was no answer. Panic surged through me. I was alone. No one was coming to help me. I backed away from the door, keeping my eyes on it, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. My mind was racing, trying to think of what to do. Should I leave? Should I run to my car and get out of here? But just as I was about to grab my keys and make a break for it, the knocking came again. This time it was louder, more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Whoever was out there wasn't giving up. They wanted in. In. I didn't know what to do. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get out, but my body was frozen with fear. I stood there, staring at the door, waiting for the inevitable. Then, suddenly, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I waited, holding my breath, expecting anything to happen, but there was nothing. Cautiously, I crept toward the door, peeking through the peephole once more. And again, the hallway was empty. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. I couldn't stay here. Something was wrong with this place, and I needed to leave. Now. I grabbed my bag and keys, threw on my shoes, and bolted out the door, not bothering to look back. The night air was cold as I raced to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I got in, locked the doors, and sped out of the parking lot, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave, but the road was empty. I didn't stop. Driving until I reached the next town, where I found a much busier, much brighter hotel. I didn't care about the price. I just needed to be somewhere with people around, somewhere I didn't feel like I was being hunted. I never found out who was at that motel or why they had been knocking on my door, but I'll never forget the sound of that doorknob turning or the way the knock seemed to follow me into my nightmares for weeks after. And I'll never stay at a roadside motel again. Story 12. The long walk home and the pursuers. It was later than it should have been, and I was walking home alone. The streets were empty, as they always were in my quiet suburban neighborhood. The only sounds were the faint hum of streetlights and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I had just finished a long shift at the restaurant and, as usual, had missed the last bus home. Normally, it didn't bother me. The walk wasn't far, maybe 20 minutes, and I enjoyed the peaceful solitude that came with walking under the stars. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the air was heavy, and the silence felt oppressive, as if the whole world was holding its breath. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder and kept walking, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. I told myself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me, that I was imagining the strange weight that hung in the air. But as I turned the corner onto the long, deserted stretch of road that led to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was just an echo of my own steps, bouncing off the walls of the narrow street. I slowed my pace, listening carefully, and sure enough, the footsteps behind me slowed too. My heart began to race. I picked up my pace, and the footsteps did the same, matching my rhythm. Someone was following me. I glanced over my shoulder, trying to be subtle about it, but in the dim glow of the streetlights, I couldn't see anyone. The sidewalk behind me was empty, just as it had been when I turned onto the street. But I knew I wasn't alone. I could hear them, whoever they were, just out of sight, their footsteps mirroring mine. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening as a wave of panic washed over me. I didn't have much farther to go, just a few more blocks, but with every step I took, the footsteps behind me seemed to grow louder, closer. I turned my head again, this time more deliberately, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw them. 3 figures moving silently in the shadows just outside the range of the streetlights. They were far enough away that I couldn't make out their faces, but I could see the way they moved, deliberate, predatory. They weren't just walking. They were following. Panic surged through me, and I quickened my pace, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe they were just heading in the same direction, minding their own business. But something in my gut told me that wasn't the case. The figures matched my speed, closing the distance between us with every step. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I call for help? My phone was in my pocket, but my hands were shaking so badly that I wasn't sure I'd be able to dial a number. I could feel the weight of their gaze on me, even though they were still too far away for me to see their faces. I picked up the pace again, nearly jogging now, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The street stretched out ahead of me, long and empty, and my apartment still felt miles away. The footsteps behind me grew faster, more urgent, and the figures were gaining on me. I was out of options. I broke into a full sprint. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran, my feet slamming against the pavement. I could hear the footsteps behind me, quick and heavy, as the figures gave chase. They were getting closer. I could feel it, their presence, their intention. They weren't just following me. They were hunting me. I ran faster than I ever had before, my lungs burning with the effort. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground, but I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I had to focus on the road ahead, on the safety of my apartment just a few blocks away. But I could hear them. They were almost on top of me now, their footsteps pounding in my ears, so close I could almost feel their breath on my neck. I veered off the sidewalk and darted down an alleyway, my heart racing as I tried to lose them. The alley was narrow, lined with tall fences and dark corners, and I hoped it would be enough to throw them off my trail. But as I rounded the corner, I made a horrifying realization. There was no way out. The alley dead ended at a tall, chain-link fence that was too high to climb in my panic state. I skidded to a stop, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I stared at the barrier in front of me. Behind me, the footsteps slowed, and I knew they had caught up. I turned, pressing my back against the fence, my heart pounding in my chest, as the 3 figures stepped into the alley, their faces still hidden in the shadows. They moved slowly, deliberately, their eyes locked on me, and I could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on me. They stopped a few feet away, standing in silence for a moment that stretched on for what felt like an eternity. One of them stepped forward, and finally I could see his face pale, with sunken eyes and a twisted grin that sent a shiver down my spine. "Looks like you've had a long night," he said, his voice low and mocking. "Mind if we keep you company?" My blood ran cold. I pressed myself harder against the fence, my mind racing with panic. There was no escape, nowhere to run. The other 2 figures stepped closer, their faces twisted in the same eerie smile. They didn't say a word, but their presence spoke volumes. They weren't here by accident. They had followed me, hunted me, and now they had me cornered. "What do you want?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The leader tilted his head, still smiling that unnerving smile. "Oh, nothing much," he said. "Just a little fun." I swallowed hard, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone. But before I could dial, the man lunged at me, grabbing my wrist and pinning it against the fence. His grip was cold, impossibly strong, and his twisted grin never faltered. "You're not going anywhere," he hissed, his breath hot against my face. Panic surged through me, and I struggled against his grip, but he held me fast, his fingers digging into my skin. The other 2 figures moved in closer, their eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. I was trapped. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing for a way out, but there was nothing. No one was coming to save me. I was alone. But then, in the distance, I heard something. A faint sound, voices, footsteps coming from the street beyond the alley. I wasn't sure if it was real or just my desperate imagination, but it was enough to make the leader pause. His grip loosened for just a moment, and I took my chance. With all the strength I could muster, I shoved him back, tearing myself free from his grasp. I didn't wait to see his reaction. I bolted past him, back toward the entrance of the alley, my legs burning with exhaustion but fueled by sheer terror. I heard them shout behind me, their footsteps pounding the pavement once more. But this time I had a head start. I ran faster than I thought possible, my lungs screaming for air as I sprinted down the street, toward the faint glow of the main road ahead. I didn't stop. Not when I reached the sidewalk, not when I crossed the street, not until I saw the bright lights of a convenience store up ahead. The automatic doors slid open as I stumbled inside, gasping for breath, my heart still racing. The clerk behind the counter looked up, startled by my disheveled appearance. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. I nodded, but the truth was, I wasn't sure. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I knew was that I had escaped, barely. For the rest of the night, I sat in that convenience store, too afraid to go back outside, too terrified to finish my walk home. The thought of those figures, those men, still haunted me. I had no idea who they were or what they had wanted, but one thing was clear. They hadn't just been following me, they had been hunting me. Story 13. N. The solo camping trip and the mysterious girls. There's something magical about camping alone. It's just you, the stars, and the whisper of the wind through the trees. I've always been an outdoorsy person, so when I needed a break from the chaos of work, a solo camping trip seemed like the perfect escape. No distractions, no deadlines, just pure solitude and nature. I chose a remote spot in a national forest, miles away from any established trails or campsites. It was the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another person. Exactly what I needed. I arrived at the site just before dusk, the sun casting a warm, golden light over the treetops. The area was perfect, secluded, quiet, and surrounded by towering pines. I set up my tent at the edge of a small clearing, unpacked my gear, and started a fire to cook a simple dinner. As the sky darkened, the familiar sounds of the forest filled the air, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. It was peaceful, exactly the kind of solitude I had been craving. After dinner, I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance as the night deepened. The stars began to appear, twinkling through the gaps in the trees, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me. It was moments like these that made me love camping, the feeling of being completely disconnected from the rest of the world, alone in the vast wilderness. But as the fire began to die down and the woods grew darker, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything specific, just a vague sense of unease that settled in the pit of my stomach. The night felt too quiet. The usual symphony of nocturnal sounds had faded, leaving an eerie stillness in its place. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. The isolation was probably getting to me. After all, I hadn't seen another person since I'd left the trailhead earlier this year. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows beyond the firelight. I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, made sure my food was packed away to avoid attracting any unwanted animal visitors, and crawled into my tent. The familiar warmth of my sleeping bag was comforting, and I tried to relax as the darkness closed in around me. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only noise that broke the silence, and for a moment, I let myself believe that everything was fine. But then I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from somewhere just outside the tent. I froze, my heart skipping a beat as I listened. The growl was deep, menacing, and unlike anything I had ever heard before. It wasn't the sound of a coyote or a wolf. This was something different, something bigger. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as the growl echoed through the stillness of the night. My mind raced. What could it be? A bear, maybe. I knew the area was home to black bears, but they rarely attacked people unless provoked. I hadn't left any food out, so there was no reason for a bear to be interested in my camp. But the growl, it didn't sound like a bear. It sounded more deliberate, almost like a warning. I lay perfectly still, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to hear any other sounds. For a few moments, there was nothing, just the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. I hoped, desperately, that whatever it was had moved on, but then I heard it again. Another growl, closer this time. I sat up slowly, my breath catching in my throat. My flashlight was within reach, but I hesitated. What if I turned it on and saw something I didn't want to see? What if the light drew whatever was out there closer? I gripped the flashlight tightly, my fingers trembling as the growl came again, so close now that I could feel the vibration of it in my chest. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there waiting for whatever was out there to make a move. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The night was pitch black, the forest beyond my campsite shrouded in darkness. I couldn't see anything. No movement, no eyes gleaming in the firelight, just an impenetrable wall of shadows. Then, just as I was about to close the tent again, I saw them footprints. Large, deep footprints in the soft dirt, leading from the edge of the clearing right up to the tent. My blood ran cold as I realized the prints weren't animal tracks. They were human. Barefoot. But they were huge, far too large to belong to any person I had ever met. Panic surged through me, and I quickly zipped the tent closed, my heart pounding in my ears. What the hell was out there? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I had heard stories about strange sightings in the woods, tales of creatures that weren't quite human, of campers disappearing without a trace. But I had always dismissed them as folklore, campfire stories meant to scare people. Now, I wasn't so sure. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that I was safe inside the tent, that whatever was out there couldn't get to me. But the growl came again, so close now that it felt like it was right outside. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps moved slowly around the tent, circling me like a predator stalking its prey. I flicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness inside the tent. My hands were shaking so badly that the light wavered, casting shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. I pressed my back against the far side of the tent, my mind racing with fear. Then, without warning, the growling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there, gripping the flashlight, waiting for the next sound, the next sign that whatever was out there was still watching me. But there was nothing. No growl, no footsteps, just the eerie, suffocating quiet of the forest. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and still, there was nothing. I wanted to believe it was over, that whatever had been out there had finally moved on, but I knew better. The footprints, the growls, whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting. The night dragged on, and I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every creak, every rustle of the wind set my heart racing, my mind conjuring up images of the thing that had circled my tent, the thing that had left those enormous footprints in the dirt. I kept the flashlight on, the beam a small comfort in the overwhelming darkness. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The sun seemed to chase away the fear, the terror of the night retreating with the shadows. But even in the daylight, the memory of those growls, of those footprints, lingered. I stepped outside the tent, my legs trembling as I scanned the clearing. The footprints were still there, clear as day. They led from the edge of the forest right up to the tent, circling it before disappearing back into the trees. I stared at them, my mind racing. Whatever had made them wasn't human. It couldn't be. I didn't waste any time packing up. I needed to get out of there. Fast. The peaceful solitude I had come here for was long gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched, hunted by something that didn't belong in this world. As I hiked back to my car, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those footprints following me, or worse, the thing that had made them. But the forest was silent. Empty. It was as if the night before had never happened. But I knew better. I've camped many times since that trip, but I've never gone back to that spot. I never will. Some places aren't meant to be explored alone. Some things aren't meant to be found. Story 14. Aim. The quaint hotel and the strange breathing. There's a certain charm to staying in an old, quaint hotel. The creaky wooden floors, the antique furniture, and the history that seems to seep from the very walls. It's all part of the experience. So when I booked a weekend stay at a small, historic hotel in a quiet mountain town, I was looking forward to it. It was exactly the kind of place I loved, rustic, full of character, and nestled far away from the noise of the city. The hotel had been built over a century ago, and still retained much of its original charm. The lobby was warm and inviting, with a crackling fireplace and plush chairs, the kind you could sink into with a good book and lose track of time. The staff was friendly, and the few other guests I saw were mostly older couples, there to enjoy a quiet retreat. When I checked in, the receptionist, an older woman with a kind smile, handed me an actual brass key for my room, none of the plastic key cards you'd find in modern hotels. The room itself was on the second floor at the far end of the hallway. You'll have the place almost to yourself, she said with a chuckle. It's been a slow weekend. I smiled, happy to hear it. I wasn't looking for excitement or company. I just wanted a peaceful, relaxing weekend away. The room was perfect, small, but cozy, with a 4-poster bed and large windows that looked out over the forested hills beyond the town. The wallpaper was old-fashioned, with floral patterns that had probably been there for decades, but it only added to the room's charm. Everything felt timeless, like I had stepped into another era. The first night was uneventful. I slept soundly, wrapped in the soft, heavy blankets, the silence of the hotel lulling me into a deep sleep. In the morning, I explored the town, had lunch at a local cafe, and wandered through a few antique shops before returning to the hotel for the evening. Everything was as peaceful as I had hoped. But that changed on the second night. It was late when I returned to my room, the sky outside dark and cloudy, the wind rustling through the trees outside the window. I climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, and let out a contented sigh. The room was quiet, save for the soft ticking of an old clock on the nightstand. I turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, and closed my eyes. That's when I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, just on the edge of hearing. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the remnants of a dream, maybe. But as I lay there, straining to listen, I realized it was real. Breathing. Someone was breathing, softly, steadily, somewhere in the room. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up in bed, my ears straining to pinpoint the source of the sound. It was so quiet, barely audible over the ticking of the clock, but it was there. A slow, rhythmic breathing, as if someone was lying in the darkness just out of sight. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and turned on the flashlight, casting the beam across the room. The light flickered over the old furniture, the walls, the door, but there was no one there. The room was empty. But the breathing didn't stop. I stood up, my pulse quickening as I scanned the room, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Hello, I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No response. The breathing continued, slow and deliberate, filling the silence with its eerie rhythm. I crossed the room, my heart pounding in my chest, and checked the closet, empty. I opened the bathroom door, nothing. There was no one in the room. No one hiding. No logical explanation for the sound I was hearing. But it was real. I could hear it. Someone or something was in the room with me, breathing. I turned the flashlight toward the bed, my stomach twisting with fear as the light fell on the 4-poster frame. The bed was empty. Just blankets and pillows. But the breathing seemed louder now, more distinct, as if it was coming from the very walls themselves. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. What was happening? Was it some kind of prank, or was I imagining things? But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I grabbed my bag and keys, deciding I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I needed to get out, to be around other people. As I reached for the doorknob, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing my flashlight and plunging me into complete darkness. The breathing grew louder, more ragged, as if it was right behind me. I fumbled with the door, my hands shaking, but it wouldn't open. The lock was stuck or jammed. I pulled harder, my heart racing as the breathing drew closer, its cold breath brushing against the back of my neck. Finally, the door gave way, and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. The corridor was dimly lit by a single bulb at the far end, casting long shadows across the old carpet. I turned back to the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but the door was closed, the room as quiet and still as ever. I stood there, trembling, trying to catch my breath. The hotel was silent. No other guests, no staff, just me standing alone in the hallway, with that strange, phantom breathing still echoing in my ears. I didn't go back to the room that night. Instead, I made my way downstairs to the lobby, where I found the night receptionist sitting at the front desk. She looked up as I approached, concern flashing across her face. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice soft and steady. I shook my head, still trying to calm my racing heart. "There's something in my room." I heard breathing, but no one was there. The receptionist's expression didn't change. If anything, she seemed to grow more serious, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. "Room 12, right?" she asked quietly. I nodded, my mouth dry. She sighed, glancing toward the old ledger on the desk. "You're not the first," she said softly. "Guests have mentioned strange things in that room before. I'm sorry. If I'd known, I wouldn't have put you there." My stomach churned. "What do you mean? What's wrong with that room?" The receptionist hesitated, as if weighing whether or not to tell me the truth. Finally, she leaned in, lowering her voice. "Years ago, Before I started working here, a man stayed in that room. He was found dead in his bed the next morning. No sign of struggle, no clear cause of death, just gone. I stared at her, my mind reeling. Since then, she continued, guests have reported hearing breathing in that room. Some say it's the man's spirit, still lingering, still trapped. Others say it's something darker. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Why didn't you tell me this before? I didn't think it would happen again, she said, her voice full of regret. We don't get many complaints these days. Most guests say nothing, but some hear it. You did. I didn't know what to say. My head was spinning, my heart still racing from the fear that had gripped me in that room. All I knew was that I couldn't go back. The receptionist offered to move me to another room, but I couldn't stay in the hotel. Not after what had happened. I gathered my things, paid the bill, and left that night, driving away from the town and the strange, haunting breathing that had followed me through the walls. Even now, I can still hear it sometimes in the dead of night when the world is quiet and still. The sound of someone breathing, slow and steady, just out of sight. I'll never stay in a hotel like that again. Story 15. N. The lonely hiker and the stranger in the woods. There's something both exhilarating and eerie about hiking alone. The freedom, the solitude, the quiet serenity of nature, it's like nothing else. But with that solitude comes an undeniable sense of vulnerability. Out in the wilderness, miles away from the nearest trailhead or town, anything can happen and no one would know. That's what crossed my mind as I set out on my solo hike that weekend. I had planned to hike a less traveled trail that wound its way deep into the forest, far away from the more popular routes. It wasn't a long hike, just a few hours in and out, but it was isolated exactly what I was looking for. I needed time to clear my head, to disconnect from the chaos of work and life, and this trail promised peace and quiet. I started the hike early in the morning, just after dawn. The air was crisp, the sun barely peeking over the horizon as I made my way into the forest. The trees towered above me, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. Birds chirped in the distance, and the occasional crackle of twigs underfoot was the only other sound. It was peaceful, just me and nature. For the first hour, I didn't see another soul. The trail wound through dense woods, crossing over small streams and climbing up gentle hills. The silence was comforting, and I let myself relax, enjoying the solitude. The only sounds were the steady crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional rustle of the underbrush. But as the morning wore on, that sense of peace began to shift. It was subtle at first, a strange feeling that something wasn't quite right. The forest seemed quieter than it should have been, the usual sounds of wildlife fading away, until all that was left was an eerie stillness. I stopped for a moment, listening. Nothing. The birds had gone silent. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving the woods unnervingly quiet. A knot of unease formed in my stomach, but I brushed it off. I was deep in the forest, after all. It wasn't unusual for the sounds of nature to ebb and flow. I continued walking, but the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger with each step I took. My skin prickled with unease, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing, just the trees, standing tall and silent behind me. I picked up my pace, trying to shake off the growing tension in my chest. But no matter how fast I walked, the feeling of being watched lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I scanned the trail ahead, my eyes darting to the shadows between the trees, but I saw nothing. I was alone. Or at least I thought I was. Another hour passed, and the trail grew narrower, winding deeper into the forest. The further I went, the denser the trees became, their branches closing in overhead and casting long shadows across the path. I was miles from the trailhead now, and the sense of isolation was palpable. That's when I saw him. Up ahead, standing just off the trail, was a man. At first, I didn't register what I was seeing. He was standing so still, half hidden by the trees, that I almost mistook him for a shadow. But as I got closer, I realized he was real tall, thin, with a worn jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He was facing away from me, staring into the woods. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all morning, and the sight of another person out here, in the middle of nowhere, sent a jolt of unease through me. Something about the way he stood, so still, so deliberate, didn't feel right. I cleared my throat, trying to shake off the tension. "Hey," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet forest. "Are you okay?" The man didn't respond. He didn't even turn around. I took a hesitant step forward, my pulse quickening. "Hello," I called again. Still nothing. A chill ran down my spine. My instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get out of there, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe he was lost. Or hurt. Maybe he didn't hear me. I took another step forward, my hand instinctively tightening around the straps of my backpack. That's when he moved. Slowly, almost mechanically, the man turned his head toward me. His face was obscured by the shadow of his cap, but I could see his eyes cold, dark, and completely void of emotion. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stared at me, his gaze piercing through the silence of the woods. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Do you need help?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring. Panic surged through me. Something was wrong, very wrong. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, to get as far away from this man as possible. I took another step back, my hand shaking as I tried to keep my voice steady. "Okay, I'm going to go now," I said, my eyes never leaving his. Still, he didn't move. His expression didn't change. I turned and started walking, my pace quickening with every step. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I could feel his gaze burning into my back as I hurried down the trail. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart racing as I forced myself to keep moving, to put as much distance between myself and the stranger as possible. But the further I walked, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. The sensation of being watched grew stronger, more intense, until I could barely think straight. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the man following me, but there was nothing. The trail behind me was empty. I didn't slow down. My legs ached from the fast pace, but I couldn't stop. I had to get out of the woods. I had to get back to the safety of the trailhead, to the safety of civilization. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing through the trees behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The trail was still empty, but the footsteps continued, growing louder with each passing second. They were close, too close. I broke into a run. And my feet pounded the dirt trail as I sprinted through the woods, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees blurred past me, their branches clawing at my clothes as I raced down the narrow path. The footsteps behind me grew faster, matching my pace. Whoever or whatever was following me wasn't far behind. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. All I could do was run, my legs burning with the effort as I pushed myself harder and harder, desperate to escape. The trail twisted and turned, but I didn't slow down. I knew if I stopped, even for a moment, they would catch up. The footsteps were almost on top of me now, pounding through the forest like a drumbeat. My lungs screamed for air, my vision blurring as I rounded the final bend in the trail. Up ahead, through the trees, I could see the parking lot, the faint outline of my car. Relief flooded through me, and I pushed myself harder, my legs trembling as I sprinted toward the exit. I burst out of the forest and into the parking lot, my heart racing as I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely unlock the door. I threw myself into the car, locking the doors behind me, and sat there, gasping for breath. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the empty trailhead, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest was silent again. No footsteps, no movement. It was as if nothing had happened, as if I had imagined it all. But I knew better. I started the car and peeled out of the parking lot, my hands still trembling on the steering wheel. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I knew was that I had escaped, barely. Even now, I can still hear those footsteps in my dreams, still feel the weight of that stranger's gaze on my back. I never went hiking alone again. Story 16. The Old House and the Whispering Walls. Moving into an old house has its perks, the charm, the character, the history etched into every corner. But with that history sometimes comes things you don't expect, things you don't want. I had just bought an old, fixer-upper house on the edge of town. It was a beautiful, two-story Victorian home with large windows, creaky wooden floors, and ornate molding. The kind of place you could imagine having a long history, full of stories and memories. The house had been empty for years, abandoned by the previous owner, and left to fall into disrepair. But I saw the potential in it. It needed a lot of work, but I was excited to turn it into a home. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of renovations. I spent my days sanding floors, painting walls, and fixing leaks. The work was exhausting, but it was worth it. Slowly, the house began to transform from a decaying relic into something livable. At first, everything seemed fine. The house was quiet, peaceful even, and I enjoyed the solitude. I would spend my evenings unwinding after long days of work, sitting by the fireplace with a glass of wine, listening to the crackle of the flames. But as the weeks passed, I began to notice things, little things. things that didn't make sense. It started with the whispers. It was late one night, and I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard a faint, distant whisper. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a remnant of a dream slipping into reality. But as I lay there, my eyes closed, I realized the whisper was real. I sat up, my heart pounding as I listened. The whisper was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, a low, murmuring sound that drifted through the house like a breeze. I strained to hear the words, but I couldn't make them out. It was like someone was speaking just out of earshot, their voice muffled by the thick plaster of the walls. I got out of bed, my feet sinking into the old wooden floorboards as I crept toward the door. The whisper seemed to move, shifting from one side of the room to the other, as if it were alive, slipping through the cracks and crevices of the house. I checked the hallway. Empty. I checked the rooms downstairs. Nothing. The house was silent again, and I stood in the middle of the living room, my breath coming in short gasps. Had I imagined it? Was I just hearing things after spending so many hours alone in this creaky old house? I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing, just the house settling, or the wind slipping through the gaps in the windows. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something I couldn't explain. The whispers returned the next night, and the night after that. Every night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, the whispering would start, soft, distant, like a voice carried on the wind. It moved through the house, sometimes in the walls, sometimes in the floor beneath me, always just out of reach. I tried to ignore it. I even started sleeping with earplugs, hoping that would drown out the sound, but it didn't work. The whispers always found their way through, no matter how hard I tried to block them out. I could feel them like a presence in the house, always watching, always waiting. Then, things got worse. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. It was the knocking. It started one evening as I was making dinner. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, when I heard a soft knock. I froze, the knife still in my hand, listening. The knock came again, louder this time, as if someone or something was tapping on the walls from the inside. I followed the sound, my heart racing as I moved from room to room, trying to pinpoint the source. The knocking seemed to move, much like the whispers, shifting from one wall to the next, always staying just ahead of me. It was as if the house was alive, playing a game with me. I pounded on the walls, shouting, demanding whatever was inside to stop, but the knocking continued. It followed me, echoing through the house, growing louder and more frantic with each passing minute. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. The house was quiet again, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, was stronger than ever. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, the activity in the house escalated. The whispers grew louder, more persistent, and the knocking became more erratic. Sometimes, it would happen in the middle of the day while I was working on repairs, and I would find myself running from room to room, trying to catch whatever was making the noise. But it wasn't just the whispers and the knocking anymore. Other things started happening too. Lights would flicker on and off, even though I knew the wiring was fine. Doors would open and close on their own, despite being securely latched. Objects would move, small things at first, like keys or tools, but then larger items. I would come downstairs in the morning to find the furniture rearranged, as if someone or something had been walking through the house in the middle of the night, moving things around while I slept. I was terrified, but I didn't want to leave. This was my house, my project, and I wasn't going to let whatever was haunting it drive me away. So I did the only thing I could think of. I started documenting everything. I set up cameras in every room, hoping to catch something, anything that would explain what was happening. I kept a journal, writing down every whisper, every knock, every strange occurrence, trying to make sense of it all. But no matter how many hours of footage I reviewed, no matter how many entries I wrote in my journal, I never found an explanation. The cameras would pick up the sounds, the whispers, the knocks, but there was never anything there. No shadows, no figures, just empty rooms and disembodied voices. And the whispers, they were getting clearer. I could almost make out the words now, though they were still too muffled to understand. It was as if the house was trying to tell me something it desperately wanted me to know. Then, one night, everything changed. I was lying in bed, as usual, when the whispers started again, but this time they were louder, much louder. It was as if the voices were right next to me, speaking directly into my ear. I bolted upright, my heart racing, and listened. The words were clear now. I could hear them. Get out, Dot. Dot. I froze, my blood turning to ice as the words repeated over and over again. Get out, get out, get out, get out. Dot. The voice was no longer soft, no longer distant. It was angry, filled with a sense of urgency and malice. I jumped out of bed, grabbing my phone and flashlight, and bolted for the door. But as I reached for the doorknob, the knocking started again, loud, frantic, coming from all sides, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. I yanked open the door and ran, my heart pounding as I sprinted down the stairs, the whispers and knocking following me. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the middle of the yard, gasping for breath. The house was silent again, the windows dark and empty, as if nothing had happened, but I knew better. I knew what I had heard. I never went back inside. The next day, I put the house up for sale. I didn't care about the money I had spent on renovations. I didn't care about the time and effort I had put into fixing it up. I just wanted out. To this day, I don't know what was haunting that house or why it chose to target me, but I do know one thing: I will never, ever ignore the whispers in the walls again. Story 17. The phone call that never came. It was supposed to be a normal evening. A quiet night at home, watching TV and winding down after a long day. I had ordered takeout, poured myself a glass of wine, and was getting comfortable on the couch when my phone rang. The number wasn't one I recognized, but it had a local area code. Thinking it might be important, I answered. Hello, I said, my voice casual. At first, there was only silence on the other end. For a few seconds, I thought maybe the call had dropped, or it was one of those robocalls with a delay before the recording starts. But then, I heard a faint, ragged breath. Hello, I said again, my voice more cautious now. Who is this? More silence, followed by the sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, and unnervingly close. My skin prickled with unease, and I glanced around my living room, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. Can I help you? I asked, my heart beginning to race. Still, no answer. Just that steady breathing. I hung up, my hands trembling slightly as I set the phone down. It was probably just a prank, I told myself. Some kid messing around, trying to freak people out. But something about the call didn't sit right with me. The way the person hadn't said a word, just breathing into the phone, it felt deliberate, personal. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was overreacting. But 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. Same number. My stomach twisted with dread as I stared at the screen. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the answer button, unsure of what to do. My instincts told me not to answer, to let it go to voicemail, but a part of me needed to know, needed to hear if it was the same person. I answered. Again, there was silence. And then the breathing. This time, it was louder, more ragged, as if the person on the other end was struggling to breathe. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I could feel my pulse quicken. Who is this? I demanded, my voice sharper now. What do you want? The breathing continued, unchanging, unmoving, a heavy, rhythmic sound that seemed to echo in the stillness of my living room. I hung up again, my heart pounding in my chest. I blocked the number, feeling a wave of relief as I did. Whoever it was, they wouldn't be able to reach me now. But the relief didn't last long. An hour later, my phone rang again. This time, the number was unknown. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. How had they called me again? I had blocked the number. They shouldn't have been able to reach me, but there it was, another call, from someone who was determined to get through to me. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing with fear, trying to make sense of what was happening. But before I could gather my thoughts, the phone rang again, and again, and again. Each time, the number was unknown. I turned off my phone, my hands shaking as I set it down on the coffee table. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I could feel the walls closing in around me. Whoever was calling me wasn't going to stop. They weren't just messing around. They wanted something. I sat in the silence of my living room, listening to the faint hum of the TV in the background. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be someone I knew? Someone trying to scare me? Or was it something worse? Someone watching me, waiting for the right moment to make their move. I grabbed my phone, turning it back on with trembling hands. No new calls. No new messages. For a moment, I let out a shaky breath, hoping that maybe, just maybe, it was over. But then, the phone rang again. Unknown number. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the screen. I didn't want to answer, But something inside me, some sick curiosity, made me press the button. I lifted the phone to my ear, bracing myself for the silence. But this time, there was no breathing. There was nothing. Just the faint crackle of static. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, through the static, I heard a voice, low, distorted, almost a whisper. "I'm outside, Dot." The words sent a jolt of terror through me. I shot up from the couch, my eyes darting to the windows. The curtains were drawn, but I could feel the weight of someone or something watching me from the other side. I hung up the phone, my heart racing as I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp from the table beside me, and clutched it like a weapon. I moved slowly toward the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I reached for the curtain. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me not to look, but I had to know. I had to see if they were really out there. With one quick motion, I pulled the curtain back. The street outside was empty. Just a faint glow of streetlights, the shadows of parked cars, and the darkened windows of the houses across the street. No one was there. I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me. Maybe it was just a cruel prank. Maybe someone was trying to scare me, but they weren't actually outside. They couldn't be. It didn't make sense. I put the lamp down, my hands still trembling, and sat back on the couch, trying to calm my racing heart. I told myself it was over, that the calls would stop, that whoever was messing with me had had their fun. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Just as I started to relax, my phone buzzed again. Not a call this time, a text message. My blood ran cold as I unlocked my phone and read the message. "I see you, Dot." I dropped the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Whoever it was, they were watching me. They knew where I was, what I was doing. I glanced around the room, my eyes darting to every window, every shadow. I was trapped with nowhere to go. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The operator answered quickly, her voice calm and professional, but I could barely get the words out. "Someone's watching me," I whispered, my voice shaking. "They've been calling me. They said they're outside." The operator's tone grew more serious. "Are your doors and windows locked?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Yes." "Stay where you are. Police are on their way." I hung up the phone, clutching it in my hands as I sat on the couch, every muscle in my body tense. I listened for any sound, footsteps, a knock at the door, anything, but there was only silence. The house was deathly quiet, save for the pounding of my heart in my ears. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Then, finally, the sound of a car engine outside broke the silence. I rushed to the window and saw the flashing lights of a police cruiser pulling up to the curb. Relief flooded through me as I ran to the door, opening it just as the officer approached. He was young, with a kind but serious expression, and he asked me to explain what had happened. I told him everything, the phone calls, the breathing, the voice on the line that said they were outside. He listened carefully, then did a sweep of the property, checking the windows and doors, shining his flashlight into every shadowy corner. But there was no one there. No footprints in the yard, no signs of anyone having been outside. The officer reassured me that they would keep an eye on the neighborhood, but there wasn't much more they could do. I thanked him, but as he drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been calling wasn't done, that they were still out there, watching, waiting. I never found out who was behind those calls, or why they targeted me, but I changed my number the next day, and every night since I double-check my windows and doors, making sure they're locked. Because sometimes I still hear the faint sound of breathing in the silence, and I know, deep down, that they're still watching. Story 18. The man at the end of the road. There's something about driving at night that can be both peaceful and unnerving. The quiet hum of the engine, the empty roads, the way the darkness seems to stretch on forever, it's calming in a way, but also unsettling. You're alone, vulnerable, with nothing but the road ahead and the shadows on either side. I had been driving for hours that night, trying to make it to my destination before morning. The highway was deserted, and the only light came from the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the darkness. It was a back road, the kind that twisted and turned through empty fields and dense forests with no signs of civilization for miles. I was tired, but I knew I had to keep going. The road was long, and I didn't want to stop in the middle of nowhere. The thought of pulling over and sleeping in my car felt too risky. Something about the emptiness of the road, the isolation, made my skin crawl. That's when I saw him. Up ahead, just at the edge of my headlights, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by a tree or a stray animal crossing the road. But as I got closer, I realized it was a man standing on the side of the road, his silhouette barely visible in the darkness. He wasn't waving for help, wasn't trying to flag me down. He was just standing there, motionless. My heart skipped a beat. What was he doing out here in the middle of nowhere at this time of night? There wasn't a house or building for miles. He had no car, no flashlight, no sign of why he would be out here alone. I slowed down as I approached, my eyes locked on the figure. Something about the way he stood there perfectly still, with his head slightly tilted to the side, sent a shiver down my spine. His clothes were dark and loose, blending into the night, and I couldn't see his face. It was hidden in shadow. As I passed him, my headlights illuminated his figure for just a moment, and I caught a glimpse of his face, pale, expressionless, with eyes that seemed too dark, too hollow. He didn't move. Didn't even blink, just stared straight ahead as I drove by. I pressed my foot harder on the gas, my pulse quickening as I watched him disappear into the darkness in my rearview mirror. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Why was he out there? What had he been doing, just standing on the side of the road like that? The image of his still, unmoving figure played over and over in my mind, and the further I drove, the more unsettled I became. I told myself to forget about it. It was probably nothing, just a guy hitchhiking or walking home from somewhere. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. There had been something off about him, something I couldn't explain. I kept driving, the road stretching out endlessly before me. The night grew darker, and the trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their branches twisting and reaching toward the car. My headlights flickered for a moment, and I cursed under my breath, hoping it was just a glitch. That's when I saw him again. The man, standing on the side of the road just up ahead, exactly where I had seen him before. My heart leapt into my throat, and I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the asphalt as the car came to a stop. I stared ahead, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. He was there, standing in the exact same spot, in the exact same position, as if I had never passed him. I blinked, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. I had driven miles since I'd seen him. How could he have gotten ahead of me? How could he be standing there again, perfectly still, as if nothing had happened? I didn't know what to do. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to get out of there, but I was frozen. The man didn't move, didn't even acknowledge that I was there. He just stood there, staring into the distance, his face still hidden in shadow. Finally, I snapped out of it. I hit the gas and sped past him, my eyes glued to the road ahead, refusing to look at him as I passed. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the sweat on my palms as I gripped the steering wheel. I drove faster now, desperate to put as much distance between myself and the man as possible. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching me, following me. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The road twisted and turned, the darkness closing in around me, suffocating me. I could barely see beyond the beam of my headlights, but I kept going, determined to get away. Then, up ahead, I saw him again, standing at the side of the road. The same man. My heart stopped. My hands shook as I slammed on the brakes again, the car skidding to a halt. I stared at him, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind racing. It was impossible. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. No way he could be standing there again, in the same spot, in the same position, like a statue. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. I put the car in reverse, my eyes never leaving the man as I backed up slowly. He didn't move, didn't react, just stood there staring straight ahead as if I wasn't even there. Then, as I watched, his head slowly turned toward me. The movement was slow, unnatural, like he was a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. His face emerged from the shadows, pale and blank, his eyes dark and empty. He looked directly at me, his expression cold, devoid of any emotion. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then he smiled. It was a slow, deliberate smile, one that stretched across his face in a way that seemed impossible, unnatural. His lips curled upward, exposing rows of teeth that were too sharp, too white. I slammed my foot on the gas, the car lurching backward as I tore down the road in reverse. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with fear. I couldn't get away fast enough. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to escape. I drove for what felt like an eternity, not stopping, not looking back. The road twisted and turned, the darkness swallowing me whole, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. Not until I was sure I was far away from him. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached the nearest town. I pulled into a gas station, my hands still shaking as I parked the car. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, my heart still racing. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man standing behind me, but the parking lot was empty, illuminated by the bright lights of the gas station. For a moment, I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me. Maybe it was over. Maybe I had gotten away. But then my phone buzzed. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and stared at the screen. One new message. I opened it, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'll see you soon, Dot." I dropped the phone, my blood running cold. I never drove that road again. Story 19. The rest stop encounter. It was late in the afternoon, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long, golden shadows over the empty highway. I had been driving for hours, the monotonous stretch of asphalt blending into the barren landscape on either side of me. I hadn't seen another car for miles. The isolation was both comforting and unnerving at the same time. The only thing I had for company was the low hum of the car's engine and my racing thoughts. When I saw the small, nondescript rest stop ahead, I decided it was time for a break. The sign was faded, barely legible, but the promise of stretching my legs and getting a cold drink was too tempting to ignore. As I pulled into the parking lot, the car rolled over loose gravel, making a satisfying crunch beneath the tires. The rest stop was nearly deserted, just a few other cars scattered about, but no sign of life. The structure itself was nothing special, a concrete block building that housed restrooms, a couple of vending machines, and a few weathered picnic tables under the shade of a scraggly oak tree. It was one of those places that felt like time had forgotten it. I parked the car and stepped out, feeling the cool breeze on my face. It was a relief after the stuffy warmth inside the car. I stretched my legs and leaned back, savoring the quiet. It was the kind of stillness that only came from being miles away from civilization. There were no honking horns, no buzzing cell phones, just the distant rustle of leaves and the whisper of wind. After a few minutes, I decided to get a drink from the vending machine. As I walked over, I noticed a man across the rest stop, emerging from the shadow of the building. He was tall, with a scruffy beard, a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, and a weathered jacket that had seen better days. He walked with purpose, his long strides carrying him toward me, though there was something about his movements that felt off. I tried to keep my gaze neutral, but a small alarm bell went off in my head. Maybe it was the way he was coming directly toward me, or maybe it was the unsettling way his eyes seemed to lock onto mine as soon as he noticed me. I couldn't tell, but my instincts were screaming at me to stay alert. "Excuse me," the man called out as he drew closer. His voice had a rough edge to it, tinged with a southern drawl. "Can you help me with something?" I paused, my hand hovering over the vending machine buttons, trying to mask my unease. "Sure," I replied, keeping my tone casual but wary. "What do you need?" The man stopped a few feet away, close enough for me to see the deep lines etched into his face. His eyes flickered around, scanning the empty rest stop before returning to me. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jeans, and his stance was relaxed, but there was a strange tension in the air. "I'm a bit lost," he said slowly, his gaze narrowing slightly. "Can you tell me how to get to the nearest town?" Relief washed over me. Maybe I was overreacting, letting the isolation and the hours of driving get to me. I pulled out my phone, squinting at the screen as I tried to find a map. "I think the nearest town is about 15 miles east," I said, pointing down the highway. "You should see signs for it along the way." The man nodded, but instead of moving on, he stepped closer. His eyes flicked down the empty highway, then back at me. "You traveling alone?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was something predatory in his tone now, something that made my skin prickle. I hesitated, feeling a surge of unease creep into my chest. Every instinct told me to lie, to avoid giving this man any sense of vulnerability. "No," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm meeting some friends further down the road, just taking a little break before we catch up." The man didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, studying me with an intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Then he smiled a slow, crooked grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "That sounds nice," he said, his gaze lingering on me for a moment too long. "You must be pretty brave stopping here by yourself, though. Not many people around, you know." I forced a laugh, though it sounded strained even to my ears. "Yeah, I guess. I've done a lot of solo trips before." The man nodded slowly, as if processing what I had said, but his expression remained unreadable. Then, almost as if on cue, he shifted his weight, his eyes darting around the rest stop again. "Were you headed to?" he asked, his voice now laced with something that felt like insistence. I swallowed hard, trying to maintain my composure. This was no longer a casual conversation. The way his questions were becoming increasingly personal, the way he was inching closer, it was all wrong. My heart pounded in my chest as I faked a smile. "Just a little vacation," I said, keeping my answers vague. "Exploring a few national parks." He didn't seem convinced. His eyes narrowed, and I could see the gears turning in his head, as though he was weighing something, whether it was worth pursuing. "You got family waiting for you back home?" he asked, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The casual tone was gone, replaced with something darker. "Maybe a husband or a boyfriend who might come looking for you if you don't show up." Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't let him see how scared I was. "Yes, actually," I lied again, this time with more confidence. "He's a cop, and he's expecting me to check in soon." That seemed to throw him off for a moment. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, and for the first time since the conversation started, I saw a crack in his demeanor. He shifted on his feet, taking a step back as if reconsidering whatever thoughts had been brewing in his mind. "Well, I'd better let you get on your way then," he said, his tone suddenly lighter, almost too casual. "I wouldn't want to keep you from your trip." I nodded, my pulse still racing. "Yeah, I should get going," I said, backing away toward my car. "Good luck finding your way." The man watched me for a moment longer before turning and walking back toward the parking lot. I didn't take my eyes off him until I was safely back inside my car, locking the doors and starting the engine with trembling hands. As I pulled out of the rest stop and merged back onto the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man's car trailing behind me, but the road remained empty. For the next few miles, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, that he was waiting for the right moment to follow. After driving for nearly an hour, I finally found a more populated rest stop. This one had a gas station, a small convenience store, and a few families scattered about. I parked the car and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the encounter finally settle in. My hands were still shaking, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I grabbed my phone and dialed a friend, desperate to hear a familiar voice. As I recounted the story, the realization of how close I had come to a potentially dangerous situation hit me. The man's invasive questions, his predatory demeanor, it was all a stark reminder of the risks that came with traveling alone. I had trusted my instincts, but the thought of what could have happened if I hadn't lied, if I hadn't kept my cool, haunted me. From that day forward, I promised myself to be more cautious, to trust my gut, and to never underestimate the dangers that lurk in the most ordinary places. The open road still called to me, but I approached it with a new awareness, a heightened sense of vigilance. The world was vast and beautiful, but it was also unpredictable, and I knew I had to be prepared for whatever might come my way. Story 20. The locked room and the fading light. There's something about old houses that makes you feel like you've stepped into another world. The creaky floors, the musty smell of aged wood, and the way the walls seem to hold secrets from decades or even centuries past. I had never really been superstitious, but when I moved into the house my grandparents had left to me, I couldn't shake the feeling that it held something more than just memories. The house had been in the family for generations. It was a sprawling Victorian manor, with tall windows, winding staircases, and rooms that seemed to go on forever. My grandparents had lived there all their lives, and after they passed, it was left to me. I had visited the house a few times as a child, but I never got to explore it fully. My grandparents were always very strict about keeping certain doors locked. One of those doors was on the second floor. It was a small, unassuming door at the end of a narrow hallway, but I had always been curious about it. Every time I asked my grandparents about what was inside, they'd brush it off, telling me it was just a storage room filled with old junk. But now that the house was mine, I could finally see what was behind it. After moving in and settling down, I made my way up to the second floor one evening, the key to the locked room in my hand. The hallway was dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb, and as I approached the door, a strange feeling crept over me. The air was heavy, and the closer I got to the door, the more it felt like something or someone was waiting for me on the other side. I pushed the thought aside, telling myself it was just nerves. After all, I had always been curious about this room, and now that I had the key, I was finally going to find out what was inside. The key turned easily in the lock, and with a soft click, the door swung open. Inside, the room was small, much smaller than I had imagined. It was almost bare, except for a single window covered with thick curtains that allowed only a sliver of light to filter through. There were a few pieces of furniture scattered around an old, dusty dresser, a chair with a torn cushion, but nothing particularly remarkable. And yet, as I stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air was colder in this room, much colder than the rest of the house, and a faint, musty smell lingered in the air, like old books and forgotten memories. I closed the door behind me, the sound echoing in the silence, and took a few steps deeper into the room. That's when I noticed it. In the far corner of the room, partially hidden by shadows, was a mirror. It was old, its frame tarnished and covered in dust, but the glass was too clean. There wasn't a speck of dirt or grime on it, as if someone had just polished it. I stared at my reflection for a moment, unease creeping over me. My face looked normal, but something about the mirror made me feel watched. I couldn't explain it, but the longer I looked into it, the more I felt like I wasn't alone in the room, like there was something or someone else reflected in the glass, just out of view. I took a step closer, squinting at the reflection, but everything seemed normal. My face, the furniture behind me, the soft sliver of light from the window, it all looked perfectly ordinary. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, just behind me, in the reflection. I spun around, my heart racing, but the room was empty. There was nothing there. No movement, no figure, just the cold, quiet room. I turned back to the mirror, my hands shaking. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed, but there was no shadow this time. Just me, standing alone in the room. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Something wasn't right. The room felt wrong, like the air was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I needed to leave, now. But just as I reached for the door, the light in the room flickered. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling sputtered and dimmed, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob as the room was plunged into near darkness. And then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe just the creaking of the old house. But as I stood there, straining to listen, the whisper grew louder, more distinct. Help. Me, M-E... ... My blood ran cold. The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakable. It seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the walls and seeping through the air like smoke. I spun around, my eyes darting to every corner of the room, but I was still alone. There was no one else here, no one who could have made that sound. But the voice continued, soft and pleading, like it was coming from the very walls themselves. Please. Help me... ... I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced with questions. Where was the voice coming from? Who was it? What did they want? I reached for the door, my hand trembling, but before I could open it, the light flickered again, this time brighter, casting a harsh, unnatural glow across the room. And that's when I saw it. In the mirror, just behind my reflection, was a figure. It was faint, almost transparent, but it was there, a dark shape standing just behind me, its head tilted to the side, watching me. Its face was obscured, hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and hollow. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I stared at the reflection. My heart pounded in my chest and I wanted to run, to scream, to get out of that room as fast as I could, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the figure in the mirror. Then, slowly, the figure's hand reached out toward me. I gasped, stumbling backward, my back slamming against the door. The light flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for a split second, and when it came back on, the figure was gone. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I yanked the door open and bolted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the empty house as I raced down the stairs. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and I didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the cold night air. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing with fear. What had I just seen? Who was that in the mirror, and what had they wanted? I didn't go back into the house that night. I couldn't. The thought of that figure watching me from the mirror was enough to keep me away. The next day, I returned to the room with a friend, determined to figure out what had happened. But when we opened the door, the room was empty. The mirror was gone. We searched the entire house, but we never found it. It had vanished, just as mysteriously as it had appeared. I don't know what I saw that night, or what the whispers in the walls were trying to tell me, but I've never gone back to that room, and I've never looked into a mirror the same way again.